listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Michael Fabricant MP is trending #1 in the UK on Twitter. Apparently he's defected to the Whigs. No more unlikely than a Tory MP for Bury South, whose views are to the right of Genghis Khan, now sitting behind Sir Keir Starmer in the ranks of the Labour Party in Parliament, whilst Jeremy Corbyn sits at the door, unable to get in. Will there be war between Russia and NATO over the Ukraine? We'll be deep diving into that subject over the course of the next 3 hours. We've got a poll running on Twitter right now about it. Will Julian Assange be allowed an appeal? The verdict on that comes out tomorrow. We'll be talking to one of his foremost campaigners about that. And we'll be talking about the greatest of all African leaders, Patrice Lumumba, whose death anniversary we celebrate every year. A man killed by Britain, Belgium, and the United States of America. For why? Because he was scheduled to be the greatest of all African leaders. We'll be talking about Boris Johnson and Partygate and the whips. Whipping and stripping are definitely best done in private, but the whips have been broken out into a powerful searchlight by allegations by that well-known Conservative grandee, Billy Ragg. Who's he? He's better known than Nusrat Ghani, that's for sure. It's all coming up over the next 3 hours on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
Let me start with the ridiculous. Michael Fabricant used to share an office corridor with me and therefore shared a postman. He answered for me the almost indecipherable question, is it a wig? By telling me that Michael Fabricant had in fact 3 wigs. One that looked like he just had a haircut, one that was the optimal length, and one that was so long and unkempt that it looked like he needed a haircut, which the next week he would appear to have. A more ridiculous figure, it's hard to imagine in the British Parliament. And yet, all day and every day, and he's now trending #1 on Twitter in Britain, Michael Fabricant seems to be Boris Johnson's most stalwart defender. I make no criticism of that. It's good to be loyal to your leader if you feel that you can be, but it tells a story that Michael Fabricant is Boris Johnson's most indefatigable defender. It tells the story that he's definitely not out of the woods. That's because somebody called Sue Gray, this entire show is about people you've never heard of, by the way. Billy Ragg, Nusrat Ghani, Sue Gray. She could be a character from Little Britain, for all I know. But she holds the fate of the British Prime Minister in the palm of her hand right now, because on Tuesday, she will report on her investigation into parties at Downing Street during the lockdown. How many trestle tables constitutes a party? How many sausage rolls makes the distinction between a work event and a party? How far apart were the party goers when they clinked their wine glasses? All of the big stuff. is coming out on Tuesday. And actually, the British media is filled with virtually nothing else. That and another cockamamie story that the whips in Parliament have been putting the thumbscrews on recalcitrant members of Parliament. I've not got any thumbs. After nearly 30 years of being thumb-screwed, you would find it difficult to straighten my thumbs. The idea that Scotland Yard should be invited in to roam around the corridors of the House of Commons because somebody called Billy Ragg, who's called a senior Tory MP, he's 34 in fact, and has been in Parliament for 6 years. That means he came in 2015. He's 34 years old. But he's a senior Tory MP. They're always senior when a journalist wants to add weight and gravitas to the story. He claims that the Conservative Whip's office put the heavy on him in order to get him to vote in a certain way. It then turned out that actually he was accusing Pike, Gavin Williamson, don't tell him your name, Pike, of having threatened to withdraw a school that was to be built in his constituency if he did not support the government's line. I think it was on free school meals. Now, I served under a lot of whips and I observed the Conservative whips very closely, particularly Mrs. Thatcher's Svengali, whose name currently escapes me. It was something obscure and exotic, quixotic, like Tristan Garrell Jones, with a hyphen in between. I studied the efforts, the movements of these people very closely. But of course, for much of that nearly 30 years, I was a Labour MP. So I served under Sergeant Majorly whips who did indeed threaten to stand on your toes, to give you one in the Rolex, and who certainly made sure that you never served on any committee that you would like to have served upon, but put you, like me, in exile on parliamentary committees that lasted literally 4 years, every Tuesday and every Thursday. 4 years I sat on the King's Cross Railway Bill. It was a combination of browbeating with the occasional blandishment. Because they could never get their wicked way with me, I never got many blandishments, but I got a lot of browbeating. The Labour Chief Whip, Nick Brown, who ultimately became a friend of mine, he attended our wedding in Parliament some 10 years ago. But he used to browbeat me daily. Sometimes he was browbeating me for the government. Other times he was browbeating me for Gordon Brown, who he wanted to be the government. But either way, he bullied me, and I never told anybody about it because it would be frankly demeaning to me to tell people that I, as a grown man, was being bullied by another grown man. I, as a member of Parliament, was being bullied by another member of Parliament. Usually I just told him to get on his bike, or words to that effect, which is what Billy Ragg should have done, and Genghis Khan's mate, the new Labour MP for Bury South. But I've got to tell you, the idea that the police should be brought in, the police, what next? The King's forces? Parliament is supposed to be a place that is its own sovereign space. I'll be talking to John Mcternan, who endured, if that's the word, life under Tony Blair in 10 Downing Street. I'll be asking him about the party culture and how many trestle tables he's eaten sausage rolls off later in the show. But the big news, the most important story, is the one unfolding, way to the east of us, many thousands of miles from here, to which British men and materiel are currently being dispatched, having to take the long way round because Germany wants nothing to do with the airlift that's going on from London to Kiev. I refer, of course, to the absolutely imminent Russian invasion of the Ukraine, which has been absolutely imminent since before Christmas and is absolutely imminent tomorrow or next week. Although I saw a Ukrainian general saying today, actually Easter they thought would be the optimal time if such a thing were to happen. Our media, which lied to us about Iraq, lied to us about weapons of mass destruction, lied to us about Yugoslavia, lied to us about Afghanistan, lied to us about Libya, lied to us about Syria. The lying liars are lying again. And yet, there are fools who walk and live among us, who, as a knee jerk, can be dragooned into line with the same old questions. Well, what are we going to do about Putin, about Russia? I always hold myself back from saying, who's we? Who are you that you imagine that with a total armed force that could fit into Villa Park, Aston Villa's football ground, the entire Navy, the entire Air Force, the entire Army could fit comfortably into Villa Park? There are more people on the waiting list for season tickets at Manchester United than you have in your entire armed forces. Russia, on the other hand, is a hypersonic, thermonuclear superpower. And the Russian border is in Russia. You are in Britain. Who gave you the idea that you might have to do something about events taking place thousands of miles away between Russia and one of its neighbors? But the imperial mentality is quite difficult to shake off. There are still people in this country, I see them, even on my Twitter feed, and I thought I'd purged the most stupid from my Twitter feed, but no, even on my Twitter feed, I see fools falling into line with the state-backed propaganda that Russia has somehow done something wrong and must be punished by us. Imagine. Well, let me tell you something. Russia is no threat to us. Russia is not threatening us. But we are a threat to Russia, and we are threatening Russia. Our forces are on Russia's borders. Russia's forces are not on our borders and have never been on our borders. As a matter of fact, but for Russia's alliance with us in the Second World War, I'd be talking to you now in German. Although, of course, I wouldn't be, because there would be no such program as this, and no such person like me would be left alive. But far from treasuring, cherishing, even at this distance, that warm memory of the wartime alliance, we have been brought up since 1945 on a steady diet of hatred against Russia. In fact, it now reached the stage where we're told we should love Germany and Japan and hate Russia. That's how Orwellian all of this has become. Russia was accused in the British newspapers this morning of seeking to install pro-Russian ministers in charge of the Ukraine. The absolute reverse of what actually happened in real life in 2014, when a coup took place in Ukraine to overthrow the elected president, burn down the parliament, and sign the MPs being held at gunpoint. New laws that outlawed the Russian language in Ukraine, even though a quarter of all citizens in Ukraine are Russian nationals. Many of them now citizens as well as nationals. Their ethnicity is Russian. Their language and culture is Russian. But it was suddenly outlawed by a regime installed in a coup paid for, organized, inspired, and armored by the West, which now accuses Russia of conspiring to put pro-Russian ministers into the government in Kiev. Now, what happened to that 25% of the Ukrainian population? Well, they decided that they would not accept this coup. They were quite happy, most of them, with the elected president they already had. And so they declared themselves out with the writ of the coup authorities in Kiev, not the least because those authorities were resting on the militant fighting power of actual Nazis, people who wear swastikas, people who revere Bandera, the wartime Ukrainian nationalist leader who actually massacred Jews. I'm not making any of this up, dear viewer, dear listener. The Russian-speaking people in the east of Ukraine don't want to live under a government which is dependent on the street-fighting power of swastika-wearing, jackboot-stomping followers of the Ukrainian Nazi leader. Now, I don't believe for one single minute that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. There's a clue if you're doing the poll. Not for 1 minute do I believe that Russia wants to take over the basket case, which is Ukraine, the sick man of Europe, which is about, according to the financial newspapers and journalists in Ukraine itself, about to default upon its debt. Who would want to take over Ukraine? Certainly not the European Union, and not Russia either. But what may very well happen, and maybe this week, unless talks on Monday again between Blinken and Lavrov can avert it, what may very well happen is that Ukraine invades the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where the people don't recognize the authority of Kiev and were granted in an agreement signed by the government in Kiev at Minsk that they would have autonomy. The Ukrainian forces, now pumped full of Western weaponry, may very well try to take advantage of this moment to attack the 25% of the Ukrainian population that doesn't want anything to do with them. And if that happens, then all bets are off, because Russia clearly will not stand by and watch its compatriots slaughtered by the Ukrainian forces, their Azov Nazi battalions using Western weapons to do their dirty work. So the war might be coming yet. What will NATO do about it? Nothing. NATO will not fight to defend Ukraine. It will not go to war with Russia because it would be a very short war, a war that would end in a defeat more ignominious even than the defeat of the NATO forces who recently scuttled out in the middle of the night from Afghanistan, chased by men on bicycles, wearing sandals and carrying carbines. Russia ain't no Afghanistan. Russia ain't no Syria. Russia ain't no Iraq. The Russian army can really fight. Don't test them. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Comrade, tired of being trapped in mainstream media? Join the revolution with mother of all talk shows. Has been instrumental in making brain and heart of people stronger, like kettlebell for mind. Don't be brainwashed, CC, and open mind to new way of thinking. If you don't know how, George will teach you. If you won't learn, he will make you. Speak to Comrade Galloway if you think you're hard enough on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows with George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
Now, you'll probably want to have your say. If so, here are the numbers. If you're in the UK, remember it's absolutely free to call the show. It's 08 081 96 5522. And if you're in the United States or Canada, and again, it's absolutely free to call the show, it's +1 844 944 3344. Or you can email the show anytime at onair@moats.tv. Well, the poll has taken off. My goodness, 1,000 votes in 20 minutes. Will there be war over Ukraine between NATO and Russia? A, yes, 27%. B, no, 73%. That's on Twitter. On YouTube, it's yes, 27%, identical. No, 73%, identical. And on Telegram, it's yes, 24%, no, 76%. So you can vote on any of those platforms, on my Twitter account, on my YouTube, and do subscribe if you visit it, and on my Telegram. If you're watching us on Facebook, by the way, just to avoid the manipulations of Mr. Al G. Rhythm, please share now with every one of your friends, your contacts on Facebook, so that we can get the maximum number. Well over 500,000 people watched last week's show. In fact, on my Wednesday night broadcast, which was for the political party that I lead, not for Moats, and therefore was kind of uncut. It's only 3 days, and 257,000 people have watched the speech I made on all my platforms last Wednesday night. And I'll be doing that every Wednesday night from now on at 8 p.m. on Wednesday nights. Now, John Mcternan is an old friend of mine. He's politically poles apart from me, but I don't believe in letting politics dictate whether I'm friends with someone or not. And so note to those that have been bombarding me with demands that I don't platform John Mcternan. I'm sure many of his friends were bombarding him with the demand that he should not be appearing on my show. But that's not how he and I do things. I wanted to speak to John Mcternan for the obvious reason. He worked in Downing Street at the right hand of a British Prime Minister, in this case, Tony Blair. He also worked in Australia at the right hand of an Australian Prime Minister. So he knows a thing or two about life in Downing Street, and he knows a thing or two about how the political system works. I've no idea what attitude he takes to the knuckle crunching of whips. I certainly was never aware of him asking the whips to give me an easier time of it when he and I were in the same orbit together. I've no idea whether he thinks Sue Gray is going to bring the British Prime Minister down this week, or that it's even remotely credible that an absolutely unknown person now holds the future of Britain, Inc., in her hands. But she does. So let me go now to the one and only John Mcternan. John, thanks very much for joining me. I'll be interviewing your friend Keir Starmer later, but I'm grateful to you for the chance to interview you. You're a film man like myself, so you'll understand the reference. Were you shocked, I tell you, to discover that whips are sometimes unpleasant to the flock that they're asked to keep in order?
What shocked me, to be
We've lost John. After that build-up, I'm sure we'll get him back. Here's some social media. J. Richard Hawley says, no, there won't be a war, but imagine Mexico and the USA being in some kind of Cold War and Russia sending Mexico lethal aid. Thinking face, just saying, clinking beer mugs. Abbas says they will not take risks in confronting Russia because this will expose their weakness and limitations and will contribute to the emergence of differences on the issue to the surface. And Threat says, in politics, war is just another form of business. It's true in case of weaker states, but when it comes to big powers, they never fight conventional wars. It's bad for business. And Grazi says, possibly, one future model to prevent a country attacking another is some kind of global peacekeeping force. And Mr. Big Cog says, no, but there'll be a further, deeper war between Russia and Ukraine. And Trueheart says, America is a bully, and bullies are cowards. No way will they take on a nation capable of hitting them on their own soil. And David says, of course not, George. There is nothing to gain, and Putin has far bigger cojones than all the NATO leaders combined. And Bruno says, nobody heard it well, but Russia gave an ultimatum. Let's take some calls while we're waiting for John. Paul in Manchester on Tory infighting. Go ahead, Paul.
Hello. Good evening, George.
Good evening to you, sir. Go ahead.
Boris Johnson, the clown who's in charge of the Tory party. You know, if I was the leader of, the Labour Party, the block of wood, as you call him, I wouldn't keep shouting and bawling that he should be kicked out. What I would do is cleverly let him carry on, and eventually, because there's over 2 years left before the general election, by that time, the Tory party would be destroyed by the person who's in charge of it now. That's basically what I'm going to say.
I think that's an entirely plausible analysis of the situation. You know the old saw, be careful what you wish for. The question is, are the Tories more likely to hold on to office in 2 years' time with Boris Johnson at the helm, having been on the ropes for so long, or will they be in a better position to be re-elected with a fresh new face? I don't know, somebody like Penny Mordaunt. Full disclosure, I've got £100 on her at 66 to 1. So I'll be quids in if she's the new Tory leader. I'll put your thesis to John Mcternan right now, Paul, because John is back on the line. John, you were just about to tell us what you were shocked about.
I was shocked that the Whip's office are deciding to use public money to threaten MPs. There's always been threats around promotions, threats around deselections, which are party business, threats around little black books and stories. But this government tries to bribe voters with their own money, bribing taxpayers with their own money, giving money to the red wall seats that have been won by the Tories. They're really explicit about it. They say, vote for a Tory mayor and you will get a free port. And now what they're doing is apparently they're telling MPs, you'll not get your school, you won't get your hospital upgrade, you won't get this unless you do what we want. And that is actually corruption. It is a breach of parliamentary privilege. I'm not surprised the Metropolitan Police are investigating. And I am surprised they have just let themselves go this far, because you know how easily scared other MPs are. You don't need to go that far with them. So why break the law when you don't have to?
Are you sure they did? Have you seen any evidence, John?
I haven't, but I have heard what Christian Wakeford said, that he was told explicitly by the then Secretary of State for Education, and I've heard Chris Bryant, who's in charge of the standards processes in Parliament. I'm told, I've heard him say a dozen Tories have spoken to him. So I think he's taking it seriously and going to be investigating it as in terms of the Commons and breach of Commons privilege. So, and it does feel to me in character with them. If they're willing to say explicitly to voters, vote for us and you get pork, I'm certain that behind the scenes they go to the MPs, we promised your voters this pork, you promised it, we're taking it away from you unless you behave. Isn't
pork barreling the very stuff of politics?
It hasn't been until now. Every allocation of government funding, even under the Cameron government, was by a formula that's published. And the Towns Fund, which gave no money to Barnsley but gave money to Rishi Sunak's Richmond, is possibly the most obvious one. And the head of the department, when he was interviewed by MPs, said, well, deprivation wasn't actually one of the things we considered. We considered travel to work area and transport links. So Richmond, being rural, had fewer buses than Barnsley, being urban, and so therefore got the money. So there was some fiddling at the edges, which even the civil service were getting embarrassed about, trying to justify.
You mentioned Drakeford, is it, the Bury South MP? He did say that, but he also said to his voters he was a Tory just 2 years ago, and now it turns out he isn't. Don't you think he should step down and fight a by-election in his constituency?
I think it would be hilarious if he did, because the swing to Labour would be massive, because he would be imposed by the NEC by-election panel, so he'd be the Labour candidate. But look, I think in the end, electors choose MPs to represent them, and they vote for them with their judgment. Christian Wakeford has decided it's not in the interest of Bury South for there to be a continuation of a Tory government. I mean, I think it probably is, as your caller said, it's in the interest of the Labour Party for Boris Johnson to stay as long as possible as Prime Minister. But Christian Wakeford was obviously trying to pull the last wooden piece out of the Jenga tower to make the whole thing collapse. And I feel like we don't have a tradition in this country of automatic by-elections, and I think that would give an amazing power, wouldn't it, to the whips? If you said that when you were no longer in the parliamentary party that you were elected for, you had to have a by-election, the whips could just take the whip away from you, and there'd be an automatic by-election. So I think, again, be careful what you wish for.
Yeah, we'll come back to how likely the whole thing falling is likely to be. But I wanted to get your, not unique, of course, there have been many people have worked in Downing Street, but uniquely on this show, you didn't live in Downing Street, but you worked all the hours that God sent there. How different from the Downing Street you worked in is the Downing Street you now catch glimpses of in Partygate?
Well, we didn't have wine fridges or beer fridges under our desks. We didn't drink in the garden. I think I was in the garden 3 times. Once for the leaving party, once for a summer party, and once for a photograph with the Prime Minister. And the one time I do remember drunkenness in the gardens was when the England Test cricket team came to celebrate their great victory, and they were absolutely plastered, having had a night of drinking. They had to be steered off the wall on their way out to the garden. We had to go out for extra beer for them, and they played on Leo's play equipment. But it was such a rarity. I had an office which looked onto the garden. I would not have dared to walk out into the garden. The garden doesn't belong to the office. The garden belongs to the Prime Minister and his flat, and of course shared with Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, who has apparently not seen anything going on in Number 10 over this period. But this culture that they've got of breaking rules, of drinking, of partying. I mean, I'm a Republican, but I have to say I was scunnered by the story of them partying the night before Prince Philip's funeral, particularly when you hear that the Queen herself said she would not wish to have any lifting of the rules for herself. And so this kind of contempt for everybody.
He wasn't, to be fair, John, the Prime Minister wasn't there. He was recuperating in Chequers at that time.
No, but he said, clearly the culture was, we can party when we want. And I think, I'm sure that he will try and say, put all the worst things we'll say were done when he wasn't there. But, you know, it beggars belief that he walked out to people drinking and eating crisps and peanuts and sausage rolls from the local Tesco and thought he was going to a work event, stayed there for 25 minutes. It's, the one thing all voters know about Boris Johnson is he knows how to party. So a man who knows how to party must recognise a party.
No, I agree. It all reads to me as a non-drinker. It's like a Great Gatsby chapter. These born to rule individuals carousing at the public expense on public property. If I was running Downing Street, it would be an alcohol-free zone, as you know. But the hypocrisy that is sensed by some is that other political parties were also drinking on public property, also in close proximity to their fellows at the very same time during lockdown.
I'm not sure there were people doing that. That was he was actually working with an MP and had a beer with his meal, all of which was actually within the rules.
You're sure?
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure.
Let's move on then. Your loyalty is admirable. You're playing with a straight bat. So let me ask you, with a straight bat, do you really think that the future of this country is going to be decided this week by a woman that I personally had never heard of before, a Ms. Sue Gray? Is that right?
The future of the country, the future of the Prime Minister, is rightly in the hands of the House of Commons and in the hands of the majority party in the House of Commons, the Conservative Party. I fully expect Sue Gray, who I worked with when I was at Number 10 and who's an honourable and decent civil servant, to actually do the most damning thing she could do. Not draw a judgment on Boris Johnson, but lay out the facts. Just who did what and when, who said what and when, and against those two timelines have another timeline, which is what were the rules in force in the country at the time. And in a case like this, you don't need to lead the jury. You don't need to gild the lily. The facts, I believe, will be damning in themselves, and it will be a judgment on the Conservative Party if the MPs decide, for all the reasons they're running around with at the moment, not to take action against a Prime Minister who will be shown to have broken the rules. And there'll be lots of attempts to get this on a technicality, but in the end, you know, the thing that should be said of a Prime Minister is the buck stops with the Prime Minister. And we have a Prime Minister at the moment who wants the buck to stop with anybody apart from him. And the question is, he's sacrificed many other people's careers to the advancement of his. Is he going to be allowed by the Tory party to sacrifice the Tory party to his career?
What's your instinct then? The Tories, as we both know, have a real taste for regicide. They have, no, that's not the right phrase, fratricide. They have slaughtered leader after leader after leader, even in our time in politics. Are they going to get rid of him?
The issue is they have a cause dethroning the leader, but they don't have a candidate. And it's very difficult to mobilize. You know, normally if you're assaulted if there's a leadership challenge and you're in the leadership, you practice divide and rule. In this case, the Tories don't have to do divide and rule. The number 10 don't have to do divide and rule. The Tory party is divided. I think the thing which would get rid of the Prime Minister is if a leadership candidate like the Foreign Secretary or the Chancellor resigned and went to the backbench. That would be a challenge. And I've thought all the way through this. You see a total lack of nerve. You saw it with David Miliband could be Prime Minister today had he had the steel to take out Gordon Brown. He didn't. You have to you've got to have all the political characteristics that make you a great leader. But the one you have to absolutely have is the willingness to do the deed, to strike. And the Tories are waiting for somebody else the Tory leadership candidates are waiting for someone else to do it. And that is exactly what Boris Johnson wants. He is a man, a chancellor, who's always hoped that somebody will turn up. And he'll play for time, given time. And I just feel they will give him time. And I feel that he will be willing now. I wrote a speech that I thought he should have made when he had made his first apology, that he needs to abase himself. He needs to go further than he's ever gone, so far that people go, no, you can't take it all on yourself, Prime Minister. That's not all you. And then he should say, I have let down the voters and I've let down the country I love. And he should wrap himself in the flag. And then he should go and spend money. He should just, he's not going to stay Prime Minister unless he changes the political agenda. And he should be spending money. I think I'd listen to your opening monologue. I think it's a disgrace the size of our British Armed Forces. Put aside what you were talking about, the smallness of them is disgraceful. He should spend money on that. He should spend money on from buses to the army. He should actually be spending money and should face down Rishi Sunak. And if Rishi won't spend that money, he should say, well, I've exposed you for what you are, a man who wants my job. Now have the balls to come for me. And so I think he needs to pivot. He needs to apologise, abase himself, then pivot into action, then burn up the road. But it's not clear that he wants to follow through on that because he seems to be wanting to placate his crazy right-wingers in his party. So he doesn't want to spend money, even though that's his instinct. And so I think he's torn in this way. I think he gets through this week because I think they've got this fantasy, the Tories have got, that they'll let the local elections be bad on his watch. It's like, this is seeping out to be all about the Tory brand. And there's a point when you can't stop that. And I think they may have passed it already, but I think they may keep on testing that.
I said lastly, but forgive me, it occurs to me that I should ask you. Dominic Cummings was, in a way, an equivalent of yours in terms of position. He was very close to the Prime Minister, as you were yourself. He was dumped out unceremoniously with a cardboard box full of damning, one presumes, damning evidence. That was exceedingly foolish of Boris Johnson to dump Cummings for, it's said, his then girlfriend, now wife, Mrs. Johnson. Don't you think that was really stupid politics?
In politics, you should do what's in your own interest, not in the interest of your spouse. You need to be really hard-hearted and hard-headed. And what should have been done was a job should have been created for Dominic Cummings to review the MOD, to set up the research agency he wanted based on the Americans' DARPA, Defense research agency, to put him in charge of GCHQ, do something where he was occupied but was really subject to an NDA and wasn't going to leak against you. It was always obvious what Dominic Cummings would do if he was pushed out, and he has got all of the hallmarks of a spiteful, badly thought through decision forced upon Boris, or enjoined by Boris, but started not by Boris himself, because you need to think, don't put the people who know all about you out in the cold, and don't put people who have already, what was Dominic Cummings brought down Cameron with the Brexit referendum, brought down Theresa May using Boris Johnson, so he's going for his hat trick. And, after this, does he get to keep it?
John Mcternan, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Much obliged to you. In this week, in 1965, Winston Churchill died, aged 90. I thought he was more than 90, with his wife at his bedside. What was her name? A. Annabelle, B. Clementine, C. Catherine. Answer after the break.
The giant Labour Party sailing clearance is now on. Hurry now, as we've got zero interest in our party. It's literally the lowest it's ever been. Give up on the common man and save today. That's right, we're getting rid of all of the Corbynites. Literally every single one. Being a Blairite has never been more in style. Only available at what should be the UK's biggest political party. The new Labour Party. We're doing this again.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
It was Oh My Darling Clementine, Winston Churchill's widow. And he was 90. I was wrong. The editor was right. That's the first. I mean, that's what's normal. Will there be war over Ukraine between NATO and Russia? Yes, 25%. No, 75%. That's on my Twitter feed. On my YouTube, it's yes, 26%. No, 74%. And on Telegram, it's yes, 24%. No, 76%. Lots and lots of you have voted, but you've still got, well, more than an hour to get your opinion registered. One man who knows the area better than anyone else on the show tonight, including me, is Dean O'Brien, who is a freelance correspondent. He was on the show not so long ago. We didn't expect Dean to be back quite so quickly, but as we might be on the eve of a devastating war, we thought we better bring him back. Dean, thanks for joining us again on the mother of all talk shows. How optimistic, pessimistic are you about the possibilities of war?
It's a tough one, George, to be honest, because obviously what we're seeing America, yet again, shipping in lots of military aid. The British joining on this week as well, sending in more military aid. This isn't what it needs. It needs discussion, it needs talk. They should be putting together a platform of the leaders from Ukraine, from the separatist republics to sit and talk, not sending more military aid over there.
Well, it was already agreed in the Minsk agreement that the government in Kiev would negotiate with the autonomous areas, formalizing their autonomy. What progress has been made on that?
None. President Zelensky has refused time and time again to speak to the leaders. So the top and bottom of it is, whilst President Zelensky is in power in Ukraine, the war will continue. There'll be no peace.
Do you attribute the current crisis to him being in the presidency, or would any of the Ukrainian nationalist leaders be the same?
Well, this is the problem that I've had before, George, because what happens is when Ukraine get a change of president, it's the same goods, just packaged differently. One oligarch replaces another. What they need is a totally different president, somebody with a different political perspective as well, somebody that takes into account the massive Russian population that exists in Ukraine. This conflict is not black and white. There are so many different angles to it. And one of them is the huge Russian speaking population that live in Ukraine. You've got many people there whose mothers are Ukrainian, fathers are Russian. You've got that as well. So people are half and half, basically. So it's not as clear cut as Western media would have you believe that Russians are in Ukraine.
Well, of course, according to the British newspapers this morning, Russia has already picked the next government in Kiev, and they actually named several people, none of whom I think are even in Ukraine, who have been handpicked by Moscow to be the government in Kiev. How credible was that?
It's not credible. It's such a nonsense, isn't it? They're just really clutching at straws now. It stinks of desperation.
Now, you know, you say it's complex, and of course it is, but I don't believe that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. Who'd want to take over Ukraine? In the financial press this very day, it's said that Ukraine is about to renege on its debt. It's unable to pay. It's going to go effectively bankrupt. It's a country that the European Union wouldn't touch with a barge pole. So why would Russia want to take over Ukraine? So I don't believe that Russia is going to invade Ukraine, but I do think there's a real possibility of Ukraine invading the hitherto autonomous areas. Is that the way this thing might start?
Yes. I mean, we've seen the report come in today how a sabotage unit entered the Lugansk People's Republic yesterday. They've captured a soldier. So they went across the contact line, captured a soldier who they've again taken prisoner. They've done this. They've done one a month for the past 4 months, where they've gone in, captured a serving officer of the Lugansk People's Republic, and took them back. So they are trying to kick something off to provoke the conflict, and then they'll just use that as an excuse.
What's the relative military balance? As I understand it, the armed forces of these unrecognized People's republics are workers, miners and factory workers and so on. They'd be up against a professional army in the form of the Ukrainian army.
Of course, very few have got full military experience. I mean, obviously, in the early days, many of these may have been Ukrainian servicemen, but for national service, that kind of thing. But the majority of these fighters came from normal professional jobs. They left their wives, families. They are a lot of them from the mining community, which Donetsk is famous for. They've worked in steel factories. So, yeah, and nobody will deny that they are heavily outnumbered by the Ukrainian army.
So if the Ukrainian army did seek to retake this territory, although God knows what they imagine would happen after that, if the miners and the steel workers stand and fight, there could be a slaughter. Russia could not turn a Nelson's eye to that, could they?
No, they can't. And you're right on the money there. It would be a slaughter. But we have to take into account as well, the people in these Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, many are Russian passport holders now. So technically they are Russian citizens, and Vladimir Putin is well within his rights to go in and defend those citizens should they come under attack. So I think the last I heard it was 350,000 there are Russian passport holders. So if Ukrainian forces do go in, they can expect Russian forces to go in to protect their population. It's as simple as that.
So we could very well have a war without Russia invading Ukraine, at least not before the Ukraine had invaded and started killing Russian citizens in eastern Ukraine.
Exactly. I mean, we saw how this week I don't know if you saw what I posted earlier this week in Lviv, in western Ukraine, where they've been daubing posters over shops that have got signs in Russian, or they speak Russian in the shops. The nationalists have been going there, and it's very reminiscent of 1930s Germany. They've been putting the posters on there telling people to boycott the shops, to not go there. If you do go in the shops, you're being physically abused and verbally abused. Replace them posters with a yellow star. You could be anywhere.
Well, of course, not all of the Ukrainian nationalists are fascists, of course, but no one can deny, certainly not the Israeli embassy in Kiev, which is regularly complaining about them. You could not deny that the anti-Semitic hordes that followed Bandera has its descendant in the Azov battalion, which is now a part of the official Ukrainian army.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I remember back in 2018, when I was in government-controlled Ukraine, I made a point of going down to the Azov battalion headquarters in Mariupol, just to have a look round, and people there, just outside the front of the building, there's like a sort of like a coffee shop, and the Azov battalion guys gather there openly with swastika tattoos, with wolf's hook, odal rune, similar Nazi symbols from those times, and it's just socially accepted there.
Yeah, I mean, giving Hitler salutes is a no-no in almost every part of the world, but it's de rigueur down on the street in Ukraine amongst these kind of people.
Of course it is. I mean, and what surprises me, if you were America or the UK, how can you supply arms to a country like this where Nazi glorification is just the norm? It is the norm. It doesn't shock me. People send me pictures and videos all the time, and I've become kind of like desensitized to it.
Yes, perhaps the British and American people don't know.
Well, that's true. I mean, we try and share as much as we can on social media, but you can only do so much. They need to wake up, really. I'm also puzzled as to why Western media, they're very quick to put Putin this, Putin that on the cover of the paper. Why not look at the glorification of Nazism in Ukraine?
Well, I've never seen that in any mainstream media, though every foreign correspondent for every mainstream media outfit in Britain obviously knows what you are saying to be true. They know it, but they do not report it. Therefore, they are willfully covering up the fact that we are sending weapons and lethal aid to people, a part of whose forces are goose-stepping, Sieg-heiling, swastika-wearing Nazis. You couldn't make it up, Dean. Thanks very much for joining us. Might have to have you next week as well if it all kicks off, if the balloon goes up. Thanks for joining us. Will there be war over Ukraine between NATO and Russia? Well, you tell me on the poll, on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube, and on my Telegram. Coming up in the next hour, Vijay Prashad, one of the most eloquent of all of our guests, on Patrice Lumumba, the greatest of all African leaders, who was murdered, of course, by Britain, Belgium, and the United States. But it's time, I think, for the news with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik News.
Britain's Deputy Prime Minister has said that the United Kingdom will stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, but it is extremely unlikely British troops will be sent to the Russian border. Dominic Raab said the UK and other nations will enforce economic and financial sanctions on Moscow if Russia invades Ukraine, as troops are reported to have massed at the border. We will support them in defending themselves, Raab said. He added, but also to the international community, to NATO allies in the West, we're standing shoulder to shoulder, saying there will be very serious consequences if Russia takes this move to try and invade and also install a puppet regime. The head of the German Navy has resigned after coming under fire for saying Russian President Vladimir Putin deserved respect and that Kiev would never win back annexed Crimea from Moscow. Vice Admiral K. Achim Schoenbach made the comments at a think tank discussion in India on Friday, coming at a sensitive time as Russia has amassed tens of thousands of troops on Ukraine's borders. At the discussion in New Delhi on Friday, Schoenbach said the President Putin seeks to be treated as an equal by the West. The Conservative Member of Parliament, Nusrat Ghani, has said the Prime Minister told her he could not get involved after she claimed to have been sacked because of concerns about her Muslimness. Earlier, Boris Johnson's official spokesman confirmed the pair met to discuss her claims that the Tory whip told her her faith was raised as an issue after she was sacked as a junior transport minister in a February 2020 reshuffle. The spokesman added that 9 days after the conversation, Johnson, quote, wrote to her expressing his serious concern and invited her to lodge a formal complaint. A 75-year-old adventurer has been found dead during an attempt to row across the Atlantic Ocean alone, his support team have said. The Frenchman, Jean-Jacques Savin, had activated 2 distress signals overnight, Thursday to Friday. Quote, unfortunately, this time the ocean was stronger than our friend who loves sailing and the sea so much, a statement by his team on Facebook page said. On Friday, Portuguese maritime officials found his overturned rowing boat off the coast of Azores, an autonomous Portuguese archipelago in the North Atlantic. The next day, they sent down a diver to search it, who found the former paratrooper's body lifeless inside the cabin. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been forced to postpone her wedding after she placed the entire country on the highest level of COVID-19 restrictions. She made the announcement after 9 cases of the Omicron variant were detected in a single family that flew to Auckland earlier this month. From Monday, New Zealanders will face strict coronavirus restrictions, and the Prime Minister herself has been forced to delay her wedding to longtime partner Clark Gayford. Intense fighting is taking place in northeastern Syria after Islamic State fighters tried to break inmates out of a Kurdish-run prison. Kurdish-led forces backed by US airstrikes have been battling militants in the city of Hasaka since Thursday. The assault on the prison is one of the group's most ambitious since its defeat in Syria nearly 3 years ago. The overcrowded site houses 3,500 suspected IS members, including some of its leaders, a monitoring group says. Hundreds of jihadists have been recaptured since the breakout, but some are still on the run, the Syrian Observatory for Humanitarian Rights said. Kurdish security forces have surrounded the prison and are fighting for control of nearby neighbourhoods. The Syrian Observatory says at least 77 IS members and 39 Kurdish fighters, including internal security forces, prison guards and counter-terrorism forces, have been killed in violence inside and outside the prison since the start of the attack. And finally, it's brass monkeys. Police in Pennsylvania are trying to track down dozens of monkeys that escaped after the truck transporting them crashed. With temperatures plunging to close to minus 20 degrees overnight, there were concerns of the well-being of the primates. Police in Montour County said a truck carrying around 100 monkeys was involved in a crash with a bin lorry. Most of the animals didn't escape, but at least 3 of the animals were thought to be on the loose in the countryside, in an area about 100 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Reports said a 4th primate escaped but had been recaptured. Local media reported that the monkeys had been travelling to a laboratory. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Love.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, I always describe Patrice Lumumba as the greatest of all African leaders. He wasn't given time to prove that to everybody else, but that's because the everybody else that killed him feared that I would turn out to be right and that he would not just become the president of a united Congo, the richest country in Africa, but his Pan-African vision and his vision of Africa as part of the non-aligned movement that would never be at the service or be reoccupied by the imperial powers was so dazzlingly powerful. I believe he was a truly great man, and I'd like you to be persuaded of it. Vijay Prashad is the most persuasive historian and commentator that I know. He's been on the show before, but here he is now on this auspicious period when we remember Lumumba and we remember the grisly end that the empire had in store for him. New documents emerging just this weekend, making clear just how deeply the British as well as the beastly Belgian colonists were involved with the CIA and with Lyndon Johnson to destroy not just Lumumba, but the whole possibility of the Congo being the success story that I am convinced it could have been. Vijay Prashad joins us now. Thank you, Vijay. Always a pleasure to see you. Let's not just take my word for it. You give us, give the audience your view on the greatness, or otherwise, of Patrice Lumumba.
You see, George, it's great to be back with you. It's just after the 61st death anniversary, assassination anniversary of Patrice Lumumba. He was assassinated very brutally by Western intelligence services working with the military forces that had essentially mutinied against his government. The situation was so gruesome that his body was essentially disappeared. They knew that the myth, the vision of having a Lumumba body, to bury and therefore a place where his supporters could go was too much for them to bear. They destroyed his body. Whatever remains were there were taken back to Belgium, and till today, 61 years later, there's a debate going on about his remains. There was an agreement to bring the tooth and other parts of Lumumba's body back to the Congo on the 17th of January. That fell apart. The president of Congo said, well, it had to do with COVID. Let's delay till June. In fact, there are serious disagreements among various parties about what should be done. The family of Patrice Lumumba, his children, have said his body's return to the Congo must not be used to strengthen the political forces around the president. I mean, we're talking about a man who would have been the leader for a long period of one of the great countries in Africa. He was only allowed to be the prime minister from June 1960 to September 1960, just a matter of a few months. And I want to say a few words about that. When he came to power, led by people like Kwame Nkrumah, whom he looked up to as his mentor, Patrice Lumumba had a very simple agenda for the country. He wanted to take hold of the country, Africanize the bureaucracy. Belgians were absolutely against that. He wanted to unify the country, to get rid of ethnic and tribal divisions, something that continues to plague the Congo till today, and which is what allows the Congo to be so heavily exploited by multinational corporations, the use of ethnicities against each other and so on. He was prevented from doing that. And thirdly, he wanted to create a military that was patriotic, a Congolese military, not a military that would be beholden to Western intelligence services and military forces. And in fact, trying to create a Congolese military, which should be, in fact, the purpose of any government to create a patriotic defense force. In trying to do that, he found himself in front of a mutiny of some senior officials who we later learned were in the pay of either Belgian intelligence or of the CIA. Everything he tried to do was fairly commonsensical. It wasn't such a radical agenda. It was a common sense agenda to build a country. And he was prevented from doing that. He was brutally murdered 61 years ago. It's very difficult to forget that the killing of Lumumba, the killing of Thomas Sankara and other people have really taken away from the African people the possibilities of constructing a future. I think that's something that should be remembered now, particularly as these documents, as you say, make their way out of the grisly archives into the present, into sunlight, and we're able to see the role that Western intelligence played in this really very barbaric act.
I watched Oliver Stone's latest oeuvre about the killing of Jack Kennedy during the week, a very fine piece of work, a four-parter that it is. Oliver, I suppose you could say, extends the thesis that Kennedy was sympathetic to Congolese independence. He was hostile to Belgian colonialism, that he admired Lumumba, and for that matter, Nkrumah, but that Dulles, the head of the CIA, was acting as basically an agency that was at war with its own president on Congo matters. And as soon as Kennedy was killed, Johnson changed the attitude of the United States completely and backed the coming to power of Suharto, the brute, I'm getting my brutes mixed up, of Mbuto Seko Seko, who became the greatest thief of the 20th century, who looted billions from the people of the Congo. I mean, billions of dollars, backed by the United States throughout. Is that your reading? Do you agree with Oliver?
Well, you know, I know that Oliver's work is very close to the view that Jack Kennedy was killed because, you know, he had sympathetic views not only to Nkrumah and Lumumba, as you say, but also perhaps even to the Cuban Revolution. That's a view that's there. But I think there's something deeper here than merely Dulles versus Kennedy, or later LBJ versus the legacy of Kennedy. And that's the role of US companies and the defense sector. It's important to point out that there were very significant US-based mining companies, American Metals, for instance, knee-deep in the Congo. In fact, the United States sent as its ambassador to Belgium Bill Burden, who plays a role in the killing, overthrow first of Lumumba and then the killing. Bill Burden had stakes, you know, was involved in American Metals. You know, these are people who had ties to the big corporations. Bill Burden's also was with Lockheed Martin. By the way, if you go to Wall Street, there are remnants of the Burden financial empire. He had his own bank and so on. This was the man sent to be ambassador to Belgium, but it's not just Burden's. Shinkolombi, the large uranium mine in Katanga, in Haut-Katanga province, it's from that uranium mine that the uranium was harvested and used in Japan to bomb Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the United States government, particularly in CIA documents, you can get this very clearly, was quite absolutely forthright that there was no way they were going to allow an independent Congo to control this source of uranium. You know, it was one thing for apartheid South Africa, essentially white racist South Africa, to have some control over their nuclear program. But it was out of the question to allow Lumumba, a man committed to non-alignment, to control the source of this very high quality uranium in the Shinkolombi mine. So it's actually not just a story of, say, Kennedy, the liberal, versus Dulles, the repellent cold warrior who overthrew the government of Jacob Arbenz in Guatemala. There, the Dulles family had lots of commercial interests in United Fruit Company. Dulles' secretary was a shareholder in United Fruit Company and so on. It's not just between the liberal and this, deep state security guy. It's also the very enduring defense and commercial ties that the United States had in places like the Congo, where they just would not permit, George, they wouldn't permit any of their interests to be set aside. This is not about human rights or democracy promotion. It's not about anything like that. This was plainly naked self economic interest and military interest. The military interest comes in when we talk about uranium. The economic interest comes in when we talk about copper, the copper of Katanga, and later, of course, coltan and cobalt and other important minerals with which Congo is awash. When you say something like the Congo is the richest country in Africa, what you're saying is that the Congo has an immense amount of resources, same as Afghanistan, up to perhaps $3 trillion of resources. But the people are poor, and the people are poor because their resources have over decades been stolen and been used to enrich very small numbers of people who are around the governments of the West. And in fact, let's be clear, almost control them. So whether it's Kennedy or it's Dulles, whispering in their ear are people like Bill Burden. And they are the ones who we need to pay close attention to what they're saying and what they're doing.
We can understand the enmity of Belgium, the overthrown, effectively driven out colonial power. We can understand the fear of the empire in Washington, scared that Lumumba would take the Congo out of the Western sphere and into non-alignment, following people like Nkrumah, like Sukarno, and others grouped around the Bandung non-aligned conference and so on. We can understand both those powers. But what did Britain have to gain by being involved in the murder of Patrice Lumumba?
Well, it's an enduring question that the people of Britain must ask themselves, why Britain had such a hard time with the decolonization movement. I mean, let's put this into some context. Yes, India, Pakistan, later Bangladesh were able to wrench themselves out of British colonialism. There's a story to be told there as well, George, which is that, there are documents in the British archive which show that the British understood, look, we're going to lose India, that's true, but we better hold on to the military bases in northern Pakistan. And then the British encouraged the partition and so on. There are documents that show that these were debates in consideration and so on. Other parts of the British Empire, even the Labour government was just loath to let it go. Look at the behavior of the British government in Malaya, where during the Malaya insurgency, they used the most horrible violence against the people of Malaya. Then the terrible violence used in Kenya, during the Mau Mau period, now documented by Carolyn Elkins, a Harvard University professor, superb book on the violence used by Britain in Kenya. There was a hangover here. It is also true that Britain, France, and Israel, in a sense, miscalculated in 1956 when they tried to seize the Suez region, making a claim for that land. And the United States came in and said, no, wait a minute. You back off Britain, you back off France, Israel, go back to your borders. It's for us to define how the world is going to be. And actually, Suez is really interesting because it's at Suez that you get the sense of Britain increasingly becoming the subordinate partner to the United States. And in fact, by the time you get to the Congo in 1960-61, it's very clear that British intelligence has become the subordinate partner of the United States. It's not playing a starring role. It's out there supporting the US interests. And really, that's how you have to see British involvement in places like the Congo, places like Southeast Asia, where Britain plays a role alongside the United States in the war against the Vietnamese people. You have to see this in Britain's role, even in Guyana, in the country in South America, where there were a series of attempted coups in the 1950s, 2 of them successful, one of them with British gunboats in the Caribbean. In each of these cases, George, you begin to see, and this is markedly after Suez 1956, you begin to see Britain operate essentially, effectively, as the subordinate ally of the United States, a subordinate allyship which continues to this day.
Absolutely. Vijay Prashad, thank you very much indeed, as always, for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Let me just move Keir Starmer aside. In 1998, President Bill Clinton said, "I want to say one thing to the American people. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss," what was her surname? A. Lewinsky, B. Kandinsky, C. Malinsky. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Hi, George.
Hi.
I'm calling to say that I find the licensing fee to be quite a bargain, considering that it allows UK citizens to access some of the highest quality journalism.
Yeah, but it's a bargain
And
we're forced to make, Aaron. Don't you see the point?
I see the point, but I think the BBC has some sense of covering the shortcomings of its country's government. It covers Prince Andrew's lawsuit. It covers Boris Johnson's parties. You love talking about military campaigns of the West, George, but it seems like Mr. Putin has muzzled you when it comes to Russia's aggression.
Do you see a muzzle?
You make fun of the idea of Russian troops being on Ukraine's border right now.
Russian troops can be anywhere they like inside Russia's border. They're in Syria at the express invitation of the legitimate, recognized government of Syria. Where else are they, Aaron?
They're in Georgia. They're in Moldova.
They're not in Georgia. Now it's all becoming clear. You want to talk about the BBC's integrity, yet you have no integrity yourself. There are no Russian forces in Georgia. There are no Russian forces in the Ukraine. The only place where there are Russian forces are where they are legally invited to be. It's you who has no integrity, and it is telling indeed that it's you that's the only person to phone up in defense of the BBC. Putin doesn't muzzle me. I have never been asked by RT to say something or not to say something. That's not something that any BBC employee would ever be able to tell you. Far from being muzzled, I am entirely free to express my honestly held views. You may not like those views, but if you had any integrity, you'd surely accept that at least I genuinely believe them.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Well, President Clinton did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. Remind me to tell you sometime of the time that I caused Miss Lewinsky to storm out of the auditorium at the London School of Economics. It's a very funny story. Indeed. Will there be war over Ukraine between NATO and Russia? Yes, 27%, no, 73%. That's mirrored on the others, 26, 74 on YouTube, 20%, 80% on Telegram. 2,500 of you overwhelmingly think that there won't be war between NATO and Russia over Ukraine. I do hope that you're right, chaps. Charlie is in Utah. Let's hear from Charlie. Go ahead, Charlie.
Hi, George. I just wanted to get your take on why there has never been a successful revolution in the Western world, and why the only successful revolutions have come from the so-called third world or non-Western world. Thanks,
well, Cuba's in the Western world, and that was a successful revolution and still standing despite all of the efforts to destroy it and murder its leaders and so on. So I'm not sure that your thesis doesn't fall at that first hurdle, but I think what you really mean is not Western, but developed, from the developed capitalist countries. Why have they never had successfully a revolution yet? Would that be fair, Charlie? Is that really what you're asking?
Yes, the imperialist capitalist core, mainly Germany, France, the United Kingdom, United States. Why has the left failed?
Well, there have been, of course, attempts in Germany in particular to bring about a revolutionary transformation of Germany, and if that had succeeded, and God rest the soul of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, if that had succeeded, then Germany and Russia and what became the Soviet Union 100 years ago this year, that would have made a mighty change to things. The French people are a revolutionary people, famously, as we know. They cut the heads off their king and queen and the ruling caste in enormous numbers. And the whole history since 1789 of France has been studded with revolutions. Britain has not had a revolution for almost 350 years, isn't it, since the English Revolution. And the British ruling class have managed by I suppose, a double track approach of bending with the wind, of affording social democracy bit by bit to the working class to stave off the possibility of revolution, and also by becoming a huge imperialist power itself, and thereby imbuing even the working class in Britain with a stake in the empire. Not much of a stake compared to the stake that the rulers had, but there's no doubt that if you spend 150, 200 years occupying other people's countries and stealing their things and pumping out the propaganda that you are superior to the people whose things you're stealing, and that superiority is often based on color, certainly ethnicity, then you poison the well quite considerably, and that has happened. But it's not likely to last forever, in my view. I take the same view that Rosa Luxemburg took 100 years or more ago, when she said that the choice that will face the world is socialism or barbarism. There's not much socialism in the world, though China and Cuba remain still standing, but there's plenty of barbarism, and that barbarism is working less and less effectively. The Western imperial hard power is all they have left. They have declining soft power, propaganda power, cultural power, and they have rapidly declining economic and financial power. The financial and economic power is rising in the East, not in the West. Last word to you, Charlie.
Well, thank you, George. I just have to say that it seems to me that the system cannot be changed from within, and at least in the United States. And I think leftists need to just come to terms with that. And right now I feel like we're still in denial, and we're hoping for the system to produce the world that we all want. But I think
sadly, we don't
it's not
all
going
want
to
it.
happen that way.
Sadly, we don't all
Right.
want it. The first thing we have to do is make more people want it. Charlie in Utah, thanks for the call. Mohammed's in Reading. Go ahead, Mohammed.
Assalamu alaikum, George. How are you?
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
MashaAllah, George. Yeah. How you been keeping?
By the grace of God, good, Mohammed. You want to talk about Russia?
Yeah. It's not going to be. I don't want the conversation to go sour between us, George. You know, obviously, I'm not out there to get you. It's nothing personal against you. It's just you know, in your monologue, you mentioned Russia, you mentioned Syria, and I just question: does it not go against your integrity to be a supporter of the Russian government and also be a friend of the Syrian people?
Au contraire, if it wasn't for the Russian government and its armed forces, the Syrian people would now be ruled by the black flags of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Maybe that's what's disappointed you, Mohammed.
No, it's not. It's not one evil or another evil, George. I'm against both evils. In fact, the cluster munition and barrel bombs that have killed lots of children and innocent civilians, displaced buildings, displaced hospitals, displaced schools, you're saying that's something good, are you?
No, I'm saying that if Al-Qaeda and ISIS, backed by people who think like them around the world, including here in Britain, maybe even, who knows, in Reading, and the satrapies of the Persian Gulf, coughing up the money to pay for it, backed by Britain and the United States, if they had not launched the murderous sectarian war to destroy Syria, then none of that would have happened. Last word.
George,
go ahead, Mohammed.
No, it's not like, it really isn't the last word, George, because why you...
No, I'm giving you the last word. Don't be rude. I've got to press on. I'm giving you the last word. Don't look a gift horse. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth.
If you want to cooperate against the Syrian people in Syrian aggression and use Al-Qaeda or whoever you're using as a scapegoat, then that's your own, brainwashed, deluded perception, George.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Mohammed. Richard is in Derbyshire. Go ahead, Richard.
Hi, George. Yeah, I just wondered what your thoughts were on why there's so much bias around what's been happening in Russia, and especially the coup.
Yeah.
First time around, when you think, it's pretty disgraceful, really. The tactics.
Yeah, and nobody knows about it, Richard, because our media have deliberately distorted it. For example, all these papers this morning talking about what Russia was plotting to put in charge of the Ukrainian government is actually total projection. That's what Britain and America and the European Union actually did in 2014.
So, but what do you think the reason for that is? I mean, is it some kind of globalist agenda because Russia don't toe the line?
I think it is. Reference the call just before you. For some unfathomable reason, Britain and the United States wanted the black flags of ISIS and Al-Qaeda to be fluttering in Damascus, and Russia stopped them from doing so. Russia and in the future China will block any further attempts to invade and overthrow governments that they don't like, particularly in Iran. There's right now a naval exercise going on between the navies of Iran, China and Russia. The world is changing, Richard, and whilst there's no ideological issue here, and that's why I think Western powers have made a very serious error in so alienating Russia and so pushing it in the direction of China. Russia is a capitalist country, just like us.
I mean,
it's not a socialist
share,
country. It's not a communist
of,
country.
The values of the same people here, don't they?
Yeah, it's a Christian, capitalist, European country. But they refused to allow it to join the family of Christian, capitalist, European countries. They refused because Russia's too big, too important, too strong to be allowed in the door through the architecture that we have and would not accept orders. The thing they hate about Putin's not a communist, he's not a socialist, he believes in the same system as they do, but he demands respect for himself and for Russia, and that's what they're not prepared to afford. They're not prepared to pay that respect.
He's not willing to give up power to globalist corporations.
He's not willing to sacrifice Russia's national interests. Yeltsin was. Yeltsin was lying drunk on the floor, and we were all picking his pockets. But Putin has lifted Russia back onto its feet, and that's what they can't bear.
Yeah.
Richard, thanks for the call. Lee is in Harrow. Go ahead, Lee.
Hi, George. Listen, firstly, I was going to talk to you about Russia, but the caller before the last one, Mohammed,
he was
really
heavy
got under
manners,
my skin. Oh, do you know what? I don't understand how these people, and I see a lot of them, and I'm sure you've encountered a lot of them.
I have, unfortunately,
they believe Iraq was illegal. The Western media lies to us about everything apart from Syria.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's got to be Syria. Russia shouldn't have gone in. So what's the alternative? You know, and it's just like they want bloodshed. They want to do sectarian nonsense.
Well, it's sectarian. That's the S word, I'm afraid. Many of the same people who carried me on their shoulders, calling me a hero for my role in opposing the Anglo-American invasion and destruction of Iraq, now hate me because I will not support the same Anglo-American invasion and destruction of Syria. Go figure.
George, do you know what? You have been on the right side of history for Syria, completely, 100%. And I don't understand people like Mohammed, who called up, and I hope he's listening, who just don't see logic. You can show it to them in black and white on paper.
I do. I try, but they're strangely impervious to it. The facts are, there's only one reason why you could make me a hero for standing by Iraq, but a villain for standing by Syria, and that is a sectarian one.
Oh, of course, it's completely sectarian. It's Saudi pumping money in.
Yeah, even though, Lee, the army of Syria, which has defeated ISIS and Al-Qaeda,
is majority Sunni.
Yeah, and the alphabet soup of Islamist extremism, that army is a Sunni army. 80% of the soldiers in the Syrian army are Sunni Muslims. So what they then say, Lee, is, well, they're the wrong kind of Sunnis.
Well, do you know, just before I go on to Russia, somebody like Mohammed, tried to give me their version of events, this sectarianism nonsense. So I said, you've been to Mecca, right? And he said, yeah. I said, so when you stand shoulder to shoulder and pray to the same God, after you've prayed, you turn around to the guy next to you and ask him if he's a Shia or a Sunni. And the guy was so offended that I'd asked that. And I said, give me an answer. He didn't have an answer because they're brainwashed. I can't believe you actually tolerated Muhammad for as long. I honestly called up straight away and said I need to get on.
Yeah, well, it's not the first time I've come up against him. Anyway, last point to you, Lee.
Yeah, so I want to ask you, I think Putin must be laughing his head off, looking at Partygate. As soon as this Russia-Ukraine thing came in the press, I thought it's a distraction technique. What do you think Putin is thinking right now, looking at us? How desperate we are.
I don't think he thinks about Britain very much. It's one of the enduring fantasies of the British. I saw somebody called Liz Truss, who apparently is our foreign secretary, threatening, she was actually threatening Putin today. She threatened him. Now, first of all, I doubt if Putin even knows who she is, and I doubt if he gives a minute's thought to the British armed forces who could, as I said earlier, comfortably fit into Villa Park to watch Aston Villa play. Russia is a hypersonically armed nuclear superpower. It could turn the entire island of Britain into ash and everyone in it in an instant. So why are we sailing all the way to Russia to provoke an adversary that could swat us like a fly? Why?
It's this nonsense detraction technique of we are patriotic, let's turn. That's what the news is trying to be about instead of Partygate. I firmly believe that. I don't think they'll do anything once they get there because they know Russia's a superpower. And do you know what? If a superpower, okay, so when you look at India, for example, India, Britain, trade deals, you know, they pander to each other, that's okay. But China, Russia, they don't, so they're the enemy. They don't succumb to us, they don't do what the West tells them to do, and that's all it is, really.
You're right, Lee in Harrow. Thank you very much indeed. Now, I've dealt with Miss Lewinsky, so let me... in 1981, dissident former Labour cabinet ministers split from the Labour Party to form the SDP. What were they known as? A, Labour Light, B, the Cabal, C, the Gang of Four. It's all coming up after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
You have to remember back in 2002, 2003, there was a wish by George Bush for regime change. That's what was driving him. Nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, which of course didn't exist in Iraq. So they had to construct some sort of formula, some sort of cover story in order to persuade the British public that intervention in Iraq was right. Now, David Kelly, as an expert in weapons of mass destruction, knew that this was untrue. He knew that there were probably no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
That was a guy that could have brought down, the whole system.
I reckon you're chaff. You're being thrown up to divert our probing.
The Foreign Affairs Select Committee, that parliamentarian briefing, I think that was an indignity to him.
We saw it on the news, and my very first thought was shock. Oh my God, you know, this man is in the eye of the media hurricane. He should be protected by that, at least.
You've got blood on your hands, Prime Minister. Are you going to resign over this?
I don't know the details of how Lord Hutton happened to be selected, but what was certainly the case is that he was the right kind of judge to use from the point of view of Downing Street and the intelligence services as well.
Of the 21 days of hearing, only one half of one day was spent on discussing the forensic aspects. That is disgusting.
We were given the Hutton report the day before it was published, but actually what happened was he went too far.
The events of 2003 were disgraceful ones in this country's history, and it's unfinished business. Those responsible for an illegal war, those responsible for the death of David Kelly, have not been brought to justice. There's been no inquest into David Kelly's death. There needs to be one. We need to make sure that those who behaved in a reprehensible way in 2003 are finally brought to book.
And don't forget, you can get from Amazon the Killing Kelly DVD, and you can download it on Vimeo.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
It was, of course, the Gang of Four that broke away from the Labour Party and formed the SDP. Now they're back and running it. Now, my Killing Kelly, a film that you've just been looking at the promo of, my show in Liverpool is almost sold out. I think there's 24 tickets left, so if you want to come, please do so. It's on Monday, the 28th of March, so a while yet, but it's in the Hope Street Theatre. and 24 tickets will not be long in going. So if you are hoping to come to that, get your tickets quickly. We'll be then in Oxford Town Hall with the film on the 25th of April. Put that in your diary. You can't get the tickets yet, but it is in Oxford Town Hall, where I've had some great nights, actually, on the 25th of April. And then in Newcastle upon Tyne in May, in the month of May. I'll give you the exact date next week. Ray is on the line from North Carolina on Russia. A new caller. Ray, most welcome.
Hi, George. Thank you. I am a loyal listener of your show.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, my question is for you, your opinion about why Russia continued talking with the U.S. and NATO. If they don't bring a response, they don't bring anything to the table. I mean, why they continue the endless talking without the other side bring something to the table? I mean, a formal response.
Well, they have a promise of a formal response this week. And Blinken, as I understand it, I've not read this, but my wife told me, Blinken and Lavrov are going to meet again tomorrow. I was unaware of that, but that would seem to be one occasion on which the written response will be provided. The US have asked Russia not to publish some parts of the American response. I don't know what Russia's reaction to that will be. But they promised a written response to Russia's security concerns in the course of this week. Whether we get to see it or not, I suppose, remains to be seen. But the basic demand, and an earlier tweeter was right, Putin called this an ultimatum. Lavrov called it an ultimatum. It's a red line. Russia requires a copper-bottomed, cast iron treaty guarantee that neither Georgia or the Ukraine will be allowed to join NATO. And unless that demand is met, then Russia will have to take action. What that action will be, again, remains to be seen. But it's not action that we're likely to enjoy. Last word to you, Ray.
Appreciate it. Thank you, George. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Most kind. And that was a new caller in North Carolina. An old caller or a regular caller, but one of the best ones is Richard in Manchester. And I'm glad to welcome him back. Richard, welcome.
You're very kind, George. I feel rather humble that I've even wasted your time.
Not at all. Not
to talk
at
about
all.
Mcternan.
Ah, yes. Did you enjoy the interview?
Enjoy him. I saw him squirming. He couldn't answer any of your questions. He's a typical weasel like Lord Adonis. He's a great Blair supporter and wouldn't say anything at all about his great master. And how he could argue the point, right, that we never, he, the Labour Party, never, ever went out into the garden, and Tony Blair and everybody never, ever had parties. It was the biggest lie that I've ever heard. When Blair got in, he invited about 3,000 of the top wonderful show business people to a big champagne do. That was one of the first things that he ever did. And
That's
it went
true.
on and on.
Even I have been at a party in Downing Street as a guest of Tony Blair, believe it or not. He never asked me back, but I was at one. But I suppose the difference, Richard, is that at the time, Tony Blair wasn't giving orders to everyone else that they weren't allowed to have parties.
No, I respect what you're saying there. But this guy is a democracy denier to this country, and he's probably still at it, I don't know, behind our backs, going to the EU and like everybody else of the top 20 millionaire, billionaire, trillionaires, trying to overturn a democratic vote by the English people, by Great British, by Parliament, that 17.4 million people voted to leave, and they're still trying to overturn it. And they put into different laws and rules about Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, anything to muddy the waters to keep it going. And the latest thing is the SNP thing. We've got to wait 3 years now, I think, before she tries to go for a referendum. And I don't think she's got a cat in hell's chance. And this week, when you had little Fatty, you know, that it was a disgrace what happened. That he...
Do you mean the humble crofter, Ian Blackford?
Oh, yeah, he's only got threats in his pocket, George. Everybody knows that. But the little man...
He's had over £1 million in expenses, though.
I believe so. But there he is, with Corbyn. Sorry, not with Corbyn, with Shakir, that piece of work you got on the show.
He's Greg's on legs. Richard, he's Greg's on legs. Thanks a lot. Thanks very much for the call. Let's stay in Manchester. Jalal in Manchester. Go ahead, Jalal.
Hello there, George. How are you?
By the grace of God, I'm good. Thank you.
Good to hear. George, Vladimir is going to get really cheesed off with the situation with Ukraine, with that so-called Secretary of State, Blinken and so forth.
Blinken's out of his depth, don't you think, Jalal?
Ah, well, whoever thought that he was in his depth.
Well, I did. I mean, he looked Ivy League to me, but he's very distinctly minor league.
Ivy League doesn't mean that you're highly educated or capable of the education. It depends on how much money you've got to get in there and the influence you have. But anyway, do you reckon that Vladimir might get really upset with the situation and actually show a hand by launching a Zircon within his own territory, but very, very close to the borders?
I don't know. I have no special knowledge of what the Kremlin thinking is. But I'll say this in general, Jalal. I think that China and Russia and Iran, and to a lesser extent India, have decided that the days when the United States and its vassals could dictate what happens in the world are over. And sooner or later, somewhere or other, that's going to have to be demonstrated. And who knows how close we are to that. Time's running, Jalal. Thanks for the call. Daniel is in Dundee. Go ahead, my hometown. Daniel, welcome.
George, absolute pleasure to meet you and an honour to speak to you.
Thank you, sir.
And I wish some MPs had the same integrity you had when you were an MP, mate.
Thank you, sir. Most kind.
It's just, I was in the armed forces, I was in the Black Watch, and in 1980, it was a Cold War, we called it then, so I was based in Verl, and then I went to Berlin.
Oh, yeah.
So really, that was the main enemy to us was Russia at that time, but I'm just fed up, George. I'm fed up with this media hype, you know, and hypocrisy about Russia. I mean, well, when we invaded Iraq...
Yeah, especially as none of them will be going to the war, Daniel.
No.
And none of their sons will be going to the war.
No, and correct, George, and everything you said, and you know, and I'm now 62, so I was young then when I was 19 when I joined the Black Watch, so I don't miss when I go to war over this mediocre myth. I mean, they're stirring it up. We went from Boris Johnson, now we've gone to this. There's more important things going on in Britain or the world for this to be happening.
Why don't we pay attention to the things that are wrong in our own country? The idea that our sons should go and give their life's blood on a street in Donetsk that the vast majority of us could not identify on a map within 1,000 miles, and which has nothing whatsoever to do with us, is part of the monstrosity of this whole thing.
I agree with you, George. I mean, everything you're saying is right, and some of the people come on and giving you stick. Really, the guy you are, you stand up and speak and stand up for what you believe in, and I've always respected you for that, and I'm backing you all the way, mate.
God bless you. God bless you. Thanks, Daniel. Much appreciated. Guy is in Stoke on the Tory leadership. Guy, long time no hear.
Long time no hear, George. I'm actually in Newcastle now, but only next door. Yes, only next door. George, I want to ask you about gambling.
Yeah.
The first thing is, I bet you that the BBC aren't going to invite you onto any of their news programmes.
I wouldn't go anyway, Guy. I've banned the BBC.
Well, that may be the case, but the narrative or the account you give of the issue in the Ukraine should be heard by many people, because it's a dangerous situation.
Very.
People could lose it. And the facts that or the narrative that you've portrayed is a million miles from what we're told ordinarily. So
and you can imagine my frustration about that. Knowing the situation as I do, I feel like I did in the run-up to the Iraq War, when I could watch and hear all the lies being endlessly replayed, and when I got on to get a chance to answer them, I was treated as if I was mad or bad or both. I always say this, Guy, I would be vastly rich if everybody who wishes that they'd listened to me over Iraq gave me £1. If they gave me £1, I'd be a very rich man. No day goes by without at least one person saying to me, you were right about Iraq. I wish we'd listened to you over Iraq. Well, listen to me now over the Ukraine. Guy, last word.
Yeah, Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah.
How the hell can she be in office there? She led a debate on poultry welfare in the House of Commons. She's paid handsomely. There was, heaven knows how much that building cost to run, taxpayers' money, and it revealed that all she was babbling on about is that she'd lost a bet with some Royal Navy officers, and she had to talk, including their names, and say the word cock in the presentation. And that woman is now potentially the leader of the country. What a state we're in, George.
Well, I of course, don't support her. I don't support any Conservative leader or any Labour leader, for that matter. I just think that if I was a Tory MP, I'd want a complete break with the top notchers in the Conservative Party. I'd want somebody who looked quite good and who was female and who was elegant and eloquent. And I think she is all of those things. I disagree with everything that she believes in. But I'm trying to be a dispassionate observer and commentator here. I'm wearing my hat as a political commentator, and if I was a Tory MP, I'd look at someone like her, and I don't think they have anyone better than her. I don't think that the dripping in wealth Rishi Sunak, a pound shop Tony Blair, is going to turn their fortunes around. I think the others on the very front rank of the Conservative Party are all even less likely to do so than him. So that's why I put my money on her. That and the fact that the odds were 66-1. So you can do the maths. I've got 100 quid on her. Guy, good to hear from you again. The poll is closed now, and overwhelmingly you all think there's not going to be a war between NATO and Russia over Ukraine. 2,700 of you voted. There's a new poll up now. Will Sue Gray condemn Boris Johnson in her Partygate report? A, yes, B, no. Now, Anwar Sabar says, Mohammed, thank you very much. I couldn't have put it better myself. Seems like Mr. Galloway applies his principles selectively. I'm expecting in the last hour, Anwar, to hear from you. 08081 965522 or +1 844 944 3344. I'm expecting you to call me and have this matter out. Unless, of course, you're a gutless coward, cowering behind your computer, sending vile poison pen messages across the ether. Unless you're one of those, that's all I'm saying. Look, in the third hour, we've got Rachel Blevins. Then later in the hour, Dr. Deepa Driver on D-Day for Julian Assange. That's all after the news with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik News.
Britain's Deputy Prime Minister has said that the United Kingdom will stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine, but it is extremely unlikely British troops will be sent to the Russian border. Dominic Raab said the UK and other nations will enforce economic and financial sanctions on Moscow if Russia invades Ukraine, as troops are reported to have massed at the border. We will support them in defending themselves, Raab said. He added, but also to the international community, to NATO allies in the West, we're standing shoulder to shoulder, saying there will be very serious consequences if Russia takes this move to try and invade and also install a puppet regime. The head of the German Navy has resigned after coming under fire for saying Russian President Vladimir Putin deserved respect and that Kiev would never win back annexed Crimea from Moscow. Vice Admiral K. Achim Schoenbach made the comments at a think tank discussion in India on Friday, coming at a sensitive time as Russia has amassed tens of thousands of troops on Ukraine's borders. At the discussion in New Delhi on Friday, Schoenbach said the President Putin seeks to be treated as an equal by the West. The Conservative Member of Parliament, Nusrat Ghani, has said the Prime Minister told her he could not get involved after she claimed to have been sacked because of concerns about her Muslimness. Earlier, Boris Johnson's official spokesman confirmed the pair met to discuss her claims that the Tory whip told her her faith was raised as an issue after she was sacked as a junior transport minister in a February 2020 reshuffle. The spokesman added that 9 days after the conversation, Johnson, quote, wrote to her expressing his serious concern and invited her to lodge a formal complaint. A 75-year-old adventurer has been found dead during an attempt to row across the Atlantic Ocean alone, his support team have said. The Frenchman, Jean-Jacques Savin, had activated 2 distress signals overnight, Thursday to Friday. Quote, unfortunately, this time the ocean was stronger than our friend who loves sailing and the sea so much, a statement by his team on Facebook page said. On Friday, Portuguese maritime officials found his overturned rowing boat off the coast of Azores, an autonomous Portuguese archipelago in the North Atlantic. The next day, they sent down a diver to search it, who found the former paratrooper's body lifeless inside the cabin. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has been forced to postpone her wedding after she placed the entire country on the highest level of COVID-19 restrictions. She made the announcement after 9 cases of the Omicron variant were detected in a single family that flew to Auckland earlier this month. From Monday, New Zealanders will face strict coronavirus restrictions, and the Prime Minister herself has been forced to delay her wedding to longtime partner Clark Gayford. Intense fighting is taking place in northeastern Syria after Islamic State fighters tried to break inmates out of a Kurdish-run prison. Kurdish-led forces backed by US airstrikes have been battling militants in the city of Hasaka since Thursday. The assault on the prison is one of the group's most ambitious since its defeat in Syria nearly 3 years ago. The overcrowded site houses 3,500 suspected IS members, including some of its leaders, a monitoring group says. Hundreds of jihadists have been recaptured since the breakout, but some are still on the run, the Syrian Observatory for Humanitarian Rights said. Kurdish security forces have surrounded the prison and are fighting for control of nearby neighbourhoods. The Syrian Observatory says at least 77 IS members and 39 Kurdish fighters, including internal security forces, prison guards and counter-terrorism forces, have been killed in violence inside and outside the prison since the start of the attack. And finally, it's brass monkeys. Police in Pennsylvania are trying to track down dozens of monkeys that escaped after the truck transporting them crashed. With temperatures plunging to close to minus 20 degrees overnight, there were concerns of the well-being of the primates. Police in Monterey County said a truck carrying around 100 monkeys was involved in a crash with a bin lorry. Most of the animals didn't escape, but at least 3 of the animals were thought to be on the loose in the countryside, in an area about 100 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Reports said a 4th primate escaped but had been recaptured. Local media reported that the monkeys had been travelling to a laboratory. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Love.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway, only on Sputnik Radio.
Okay, here's the second poll. Will Sue Gray, who's she, Ed? Will Sue Gray condemn Boris Johnson in her Partygate report? So far, A, yes, she will, 19%. No, she won't, 81%. Well, of course, John Mcternan, who is amongst the small number of people in the country that know her well, worked with her in Downing Street. He thinks that she will not make a judgment, she will just lay out the facts. And he thinks, at least, that the facts will be damning, damning enough, perhaps, to force the Conservative Party to act to change their leader. Gubarwala says, actually, Kwame Nkrumah was eloquent and just as radical. That he spoke English well helped. Nevertheless, Lumumba was one of Africa's great leaders. It was Masi Chombe from the copper-rich Katanga province who played the West's game plan. He was a contemporary of Lumumba. And Yinka says the African politicians today have truly bought into this disgraceful phenomenon called globalism. It has created many political billionaires. If you want to know how destructive the philosophy of corporations has been to African progress, look no further than Nigeria. And X-Ray Star says 75 years ago, the British and Americans were killing fascists. Now they're sending them military aid. And Fra Hughes says, did Russia nominate Juan Guaido as the next Ukrainian president? Very droll indeed. Let's be joined by the one and only, remember her name, my colleague from the United States, Rachel Blevins. Rachel, welcome back. It's wonderful, as always, to see you. Well, by this time next week, your country might be at war with Russia, and we might be looking at an all-out war on the European continent. Do the American people know that?
Yeah, I think they look at it and they realize the fact that this is a region of the world that isn't close to theirs, and they've decided in many ways not to care about it. And it's interesting to see how so much of the media coverage of this situation, of course, it's no surprise that it has been beating those war drums, calling for an increase in conflict, but at the same time leaving out the facts surrounding the situation. You know, we look at the fact that just a few weeks ago, it was Russia presenting a security pact, calling for a decrease in escalations, calling for an agreement with the US and with NATO. And the United States' response to that was to say, no, we don't want to be controlled by NATO. And instead, what we've seen is we've seen the Biden administration ramping up this rhetoric. We saw, just this week, the fact that, the Biden administration shipped over 200,000 pounds of, I guess, what they are now referring to as lethal aid over to
Sounds lovely, doesn't it? Lethal aid.
Right.
This is almost an oxymoron.
Exactly. It's like the buzzword of the moment. And of course, this is something that was signed off on previously by the Biden administration. But then at the same time, you know, when we had this story that came out from the UK claiming that they knew of a plot from Russia to invade Ukraine and to take over their government and overthrow their leaders, the US hasn't even really questioned that. They've just kind of nodded along and been like, yep, that goes with exactly what we've been saying.
It's a new Steele dossier. We'll probably find that Steele wrote it.
At this point, yeah, and you know, it was funny because you know it's bad when even The Guardian, when they were reporting on this, actually had to admit that there were hardly any details in this report of exactly how Russia was supposed to carry out this government overthrow. Like, they actually had to admit that. Therefore, you know that it is a rough situation, not to mention the fact that we've got the UK out here claiming that Russia's quote-unquote pro-Russian former Ukrainian politicians they want to be in power are people who are actually sanctioned by Russia. I mean, if you really take the time to look at the facts of this, it makes no sense at all. However, when the US media takes it, what they do with it is they, you know, just kind of breeze over those facts and instead look at the headline, which they know will grab viewer attention, and instead they just tell you, well, see, we've got another country telling you that Russia's planning to invade and overthrow, and therefore the US needs to get even more involved in yet another conflict.
Well, this is what troubles me most, Rachel. The lying liars are lying again. Through the same mouthpieces, the same television stations, the same newspapers, oftentimes this very same commentators. The people that said we must invade Iraq because it has weapons of mass destruction. The people who said Gaddafi had given his army Viagra and sent them out on a campaign of mass rape. The same people who told us that Syria and the world would be better off if Al-Qaeda and ISIS were in control of Damascus, on the Mediterranean, in Syria. The same people who've lied over and over again and who are widely regarded as liars by their own people on a day-to-day basis. Most people in America think their government is lying to them. Most people in Britain think their government is habitually lying to them. But when it comes to these big international issues of war and peace, it seems that when the drums start beating, everyone falls into line again.
Yeah, you were exactly right. And on top of that, the majority of Americans also don't trust the media. And we see survey after survey of people who say that, you know, the trust in the media has come to a historic low. And yet at the same time, when you've got those mainstream media talking heads sitting there telling you, hey, Russia's about to invade, we have to step in and fight for the freedoms of the Ukrainian people, whether they want that quote unquote help or not, all of a sudden the American people think, oh, okay, we need to trust our politicians and our media once again and hop on board. I mean, it makes no sense. And it also comes back around to the fact that, you know, 20 years after the so-called war on terror, as we've seen, as you predicted, it was an absolute failure. And the cost of that war was so incredibly high, not just in terms of dollars, but in terms of civilian casualties, in terms of how much this country wasted to go and to destroy other countries on the other side of the world. And it makes no sense to me that we're now sitting here looking at a direct confrontation with Russia and actually debating as to whether or not that's something that the United States should be considering, while at the same time we also have to remember that Russia is not the country that is provoking this escalation here. Russia is the country that has consistently sat there and said, not only do we not have plans to invade, but please show us what you think that we have planned. Show us the information that you are citing when you come forward and you say these U.S. intelligence officials claim that there's going to be some kind of invasion. For as long as we have that, for as long as we have a country that is sitting there and saying, look, we don't want a war in our backyard, that's something that the American people should be paying attention to, because it brings us back to the fact that the United States is on the exact same war path, except this time around they're going up against a nuclear power, and in that kind of situation, no one wins.
Well, quite. The tropes roll out, and I know that they hit home because a close friend of mine used their language to me just the other day. Russia is massing 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, he said. But the Ukrainians have massed 125,000 forces on the Russian border. But nobody ever uses that figure. There are more Ukrainian soldiers on the Russian border than there are Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian border. But you repeat these war tropes and they definitely hit the mark. I now know that from my survey of social media and the rest, that there are people who are asking me the same questions that they asked about Iraq before the war. Well, what should we do about Saddam Hussein? What should we do about Vladimir Putin, about Russia, about Ukraine, and so on? First of all, if you do anything, you will lose. But the entire world may be enveloped in a nuclear confrontation. Because, look, of course, there'll be no immediate use of nuclear weapons. But if, say, my thesis, the Ukrainians invade the autonomous republics and begin slaughtering Russian nationals and Russian citizens, then Russia will undoubtedly enter the country. Then there'll be a war between Russia and a part of the Ukraine. Who's going to say, with their hand on their heart, that that will not spread to the neighboring countries? Who's going to say that China will not take advantage of that situation to take action in the Straits of Taiwan? Who's therefore going to say that this will not all spiral into an all-enveloping war? Are people just going to sleepwalk into that? In our country, yes. I'm presuming in your country also.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's a really good point to talk about, sort of that domino effect that we're facing here. And I also think it's important to talk about what if this situation were flipped around, because it's interesting how people always want to talk about Russian troops on Ukraine's border, yet they don't want to talk about the fact that these are troops in Russia. They also don't want to talk about the fact that if this situation were reversed, and let's say that Russia had poured $2.7 billion worth of quote-unquote lethal aid into Canada, and we saw troops lining up on the U.S. northern border, you know that the United States would be worried about it. I mean, to sit there, then we could have that conversation and say, well, what should we do? Because it would be something involving our country. But this idea that the United States needs to continue to assert itself all around the world, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in Taiwan, and needs to, really go up against these other larger countries. I mean, I don't think that the average citizen, especially here in the United States, realizes the cost that could come with that, or realizes the fact that, yeah, we can sit here all day long and talk about how the United States has the largest military budget in the world and the most advanced military, but that doesn't mean that we should be going up against a country like Russia, like China, or like the two of them combined, because at the end of the day, those politicians will sit there and they will call for that conflict, but it's not their sons and daughters who are going off to fight and to die in that war. And that's something that I really hope that people will grasp, at least before it's too late.
Now, the elephant sitting in the room, or the donkey sitting in the room, is Joe Biden. He's had a very bad week. I follow, like you do, the clips of him speaking, his press conferences, and so on. He's really reaching a stage which must be medically critical. He is incapable of carrying out his role as the commander-in-chief. If I'm right about that, who is calling the shots? Who is the commander-in-chief? Who is making these decisions? I don't believe that it's Joe Biden anymore.
Yeah, I don't believe it either, especially when you look at the fact that, this last week he was able to have a press conference. It was a good reminder of why they typically don't let him have press conferences, because he sat there and he admitted that, at least from his standpoint, he referred to it as a minor incursion, which is to say that, look, if Russia goes into Ukraine in some way, or even into some of these autonomous regions that Ukraine claims as its own, then the United States would not necessarily come in and declare World War III. Now, to you or I, that may seem like it's common sense for the U.S. to hold back a little bit from going towards World War III. However, what immediately transpired after that was that the White House and every other member of the Biden administration was working overtime to come back and say, no, Biden didn't really mean that. What he actually meant was that the U.S. fully supports Ukraine and there will be swift and severe consequences if Russia does anything. We've seen Blinken now back that up. And so I think when you're looking at Biden, it's clear in those moments that he's not calling the shots. And it does make you wonder, if not, then who is calling the shots? Who is sitting there directing his entire administration to then come back and play catch up and try to say, well, he didn't really mean what he said. And oh, by the way, he's not allowed to have press conferences anymore.
Well, you know, the United States fought most of the Second World War when it joined under Roosevelt, who was physically handicapped, but his mind was crystal clear, and a very great wartime president he turned out to be. But here you might be going into a war with a man who is not physically handicapped, but is mentally degraded to the point that it must be a clear and present danger to the Republic that at the bottom of his bed is the nuclear football. I don't understand why more people in the media, in the political class, are not actually calling that situation out in the US.
Oh, I agree, absolutely. And especially when you look at the fact that, okay, if Joe Biden can't handle it, then you have someone like Kamala Harris who can't seem to get through a single interview, let alone, I don't really want to know what she would do when it comes to a situation like that in terms of foreign policy, because she would be in one of those places of trying to prove herself and trying to prove that she could take on a country like Russia, and she would fail miserably as a result. Behind her, you've got Nancy Pelosi, who looks like she's 110 years old and has been in Congress for decades upon decades. I mean, the U.S. really isn't doing too hot in terms of this.
She's better before lunchtime, as we say here. Rachel, thanks. I'm so grateful to you. Thanks for your time again on the mother of all talk shows. Will Sue Gray condemn Boris Johnson in her Partygate report? Overwhelmingly, people think that she will not. Let's see if that one turns out to be right. Eve is in Idaho, and we're always glad to hear from him. Go ahead, Eve.
Hello, thank you for having me on the show.
Welcome.
I would like to say that the question is not if Russia is going to attack, because, you know, who attacks, you can see World War I, World War II, it's always debatable. But I think we will have a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And the reason is because the four participants want a conflict. NATO want a conflict because it justifies their existence. And also, they could admit half Ukraine within NATO once the border is settled. Ukraine wants a conflict. That's why they did Maidan and all that. The Donbass wants a conflict. You had wonderful people coming on your show to explain that life is not livable in the Donbass right now. And Russians would not mind to have the whole Azov Sea and to have these things settled. So that's my point of view, is that we will have a conflict. And it will be, I think, between Ukraine and Russia. And it will be maybe not such a bloody conflict because Russia, up to the river, I don't remember the name, but
the Dnieper, isn't it?
People, yeah, this river. People will cheer them, I think. You know, they will be happy to go back to Russia.
Okay, Eve, thanks for that. Mark is in Liverpool. Same subject. Go ahead, Mark.
Hiya, George. Can you hear me okay?
Very clearly, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you, yeah. No, I just wanted to make a point about the British approach to Ukraine and why the heck we are getting involved in being there in the first place. First of all, a month or two ago, we sailed one of our ships there, and provoked the Russian military and put our sailors in distress. Outrageous. Who's making these decisions on our behalf?
Somebody called Ben Wallace. I've no idea. If he was sitting next to me on the bus, I wouldn't know who he was.
Yeah.
He's our defence minister.
Well, yeah, exactly. And who's given him that remit to do that? And who's given the British government the remit to send weapons to Ukraine, right? That the French and the Germans didn't allow us to cross their airspace with. They have to fly all the way around.
That's right. Mark, I don't know if you know, but just this day, Ukraine summoned the German ambassador to give him a dressing down because Germany is not participating in this military supplying of the Ukrainian army. Macron himself said that Europe needs to sit down with Russia and agree a new European security architecture.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not the West. They keep saying the West,
George,
Mark.
You're right. The head of the Kriegsmarine was in Delhi a couple of days ago, and he said, Crimea belongs to Russia. Don't even think about anything else. And he's been sacked. And so he's been told to pull his pants down and expose his rear end, and But he knows what the situation is, and what the hell is this buffoon we've got as a prime minister sending military equipment and soldiers to the border of Russia.
Yeah, and soldiers.
It's outrageous.
Mark, great call. Don't be a stranger. Call back again. Wayne is in Cheshire. Let's hear from Wayne.
Always a pleasure, George.
And you, sir, go ahead.
I've got a question and an observation.
Okay.
Right, now, first of all, this is a strange one because none of the corporate media are talking about it. Russia itself, Ukraine and Europe are not even talking about this. But I think this is the elephant in the room. Question is, what percentage of European gas usage is imported from Russia through the Ukrainian pipeline?
It is an issue, and Ukraine will lose out on the transit fees if the Nord Stream 2 ever becomes operational. It is an issue, you're right.
Well, what I was thinking is obviously it's only the Ukrainian which is working at the moment. Now, I don't know the percentage, but the question is, if it's turned off by sabotage or the Russians decide to turn it off if there's a military confrontation, could Europe survive? And the main question for me is, would it affect our gas prices?
Well, of course, it's the shortage of gas has already sent the price of gas to a record high this winter. Supply is short, prices are high, and that's before a shot has been fired. If this becomes the kind of war that it might become, there'll be no Russian gas coming to Europe. And then the European governments are going to have to explain to their freezing constituents just exactly why that gas has disappeared. Look, I need to take a break. I need to get this last question in. On this day in 2020, the first COVID-19 lockdown took place. Where was it? A, Seoul, B, Auckland, C, Wuhan. Answer after the break.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It has filled our hospitals. It has killed 400 doctors, nurses, and care home professionals. friends of mine have died of it. So what exactly are you on here telling me? That it's not infectious?
I'm not sure.
Tell us what you think. Don't be coy, Roy.
Well, I'm going to quote Doctor, and he said that the pandemic was over a long time ago in a video, an unlocked video, and it's going around right now. You know, you can watch it for yourself.
Yeah. You guys are always doing your research on the internet. Look.
Okay.
Yeah, see, you have got a point of view. You are being coy, Roy. You come on here playing the daft laddie. I just saw something on the government's website. Something I can choose between Ben in Hull on YouTube, or I can trust the doctors and the medical authorities. I can trust them, or I can go with wee Ben.
I mean, I'm not
with wee Ben on YouTube.
On the Gov website.
Well, what are you saying?
These are statistics.
Tell us then. Look, you started out by saying COVID was not an infectious disease. Are you really saying that? Are you really saying that, Ben? Ben, stop being silly. Are you really saying that the coronavirus 19 is not infectious? Ben, are you really saying that?
I'm repeating what has been stated on the government website.
But I already explained to you that it was otherwise thus classified. It is a public health emergency. Aren't you aware of it? Don't you know the cost we've paid of it? Don't you know how many people have died? How many people are sick? How many doctors and nurses are dead now in the cold earth, fighting something that you're on the radio telling me doesn't exist? I have no longer any patience for this kind of juvenile nonsense.
Radio Sputnik.
The mother of all talk shows. With George Galloway. The world is our classroom, and you're welcome to sit in and join the seminar.
The answer, of course, is Wuhan had the first COVID-19 lockdown on this day in 2020. How extraordinary, how long all of this has lasted. As I predicted, when the Omicron first broke in South Africa, it has turned out to be the variant we were waiting for. And the crisis, at least here in Britain, is coming to an end, thank God. Now, it's still present, the old COVID-19 in Belmarsh. There's still people going down with it in the prison wing, in which Julian Assange, the world historic publisher and journalist, whistleblower and truth teller, has now been long incarcerated. Tomorrow, the High Court in London will deliver a decision on whether or not Julian Assange is to be allowed to appeal to the Supreme Court in Britain against the decision a month ago to allow his extradition to the United States. If the decision goes Julian's way, the bad news is he presumably remains in Belmarsh, although an attempt will undoubtedly be made to finally get bail on a tag so that he can await the appeal before the Supreme Court at home. If he loses tomorrow, the matter immediately reverts to that paragon of virtue, Priti Patel, the British Home Secretary, whose final decision on whether to allow Julian to be sent into the maw of the US injustice system will be made. One of the best and most noble campaigners for Julian Assange is Dr. Deepa Driver, a trade union leader and a campaigner of very great distinction. And she joins us now on the eve of this decision. It must be nerve-wracking, Dr. Driver, not just for you and me, but more particularly for Julian's family and for Julian himself. Set the scene for us as we await the decision tomorrow.
I hope you can hear me, George.
Yes, very well.
Thank you very much for having me on and for repeatedly making Julian's case, because, as you know, the mainstream media are being really, really quiet about the issues that are at stake. And while there is widespread support for Julian across all the human rights organizations now and across all the mainstream media even, not enough is being said about what Julian revealed and why he is in this situation. And the situation right now is one of something called lawfare, where you conduct war through the law. And the war that is being conducted in respect of Julian is to slowly wear him down, death by 1,000 cuts. And as you pointed out, he suffered a stroke in prison. He is quite unwell, and yet he is being put through a horrendous process, while at the same time, the real war criminal, Tony Blair, is being knighted and honored by the Queen. The situation with Julian is such that at the moment, he won his case at the magistrates' court stage to not be extradited to the United States. The US government then appealed that decision at the High Court and won. And now the next stage is for Julian to be given permission for his case to be taken to the Supreme Court. And that permission is given by the very same two judges who took the decision at the High Court level that the original decision on Julian should be undone, and indeed that permission should be given to extradite, or it'll go back to the lower courts for that to then go to Priti Patel to put the papers forward. Now, there's another side to this, that Julian's story and his arguments have never been really properly heard. And that's what's called a cross appeal. And so if Julian wins tomorrow, i.e. they allow him to appeal to the Supreme Court, then that appeal will continue and we'll see what the Supreme Court says. If Julian loses, it goes back to the magistrates' court to be rubber stamped and then sent on to Priti Patel. At that stage, his lawyers can then launch what is called a cross appeal to contest the other four grounds of the lower court verdict that they lost. So I hope that makes some sense as to where we are.
It does. But I'm right in saying, Amantai, that even a victory tomorrow almost certainly means another year or more of incarceration in Belmarsh for a very sick prisoner.
Indeed, and he's suffered over a decade of arbitrary detention, and the last 3 years of which have been at Belmarsh. At the heart of all this is this lack of recognition within the British courts that Julian sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, that his life was at stake. Now, we know from information that has been available through Yahoo News, 30 US government insiders have now confirmed that the United States planned to murder him or kidnap him from the Ecuadorian embassy. So he is now being released on the basis of assurances by the US government. And this is this very same government and the very same CIA and FBI who will be responsible for determining the conditions of his treatment in the US. So it is all these people who tried to kill him who are now being, in a position of control. So, the UK is not recognizing the fact that he sought asylum from these murderers. And it's very distressing to watch this injustice taking place before our eyes, with all these bewigged judges and these fantastic old buildings and this talk of the rule of law, when actually what it is murder in plain sight.
If it goes to the Supreme Court, will the Supreme Court hold effectively a hearing on the cross-appeal issues also, or only on the narrow grounds?
I believe it is only on the narrow grounds at this stage. The cross-appeal process, it depends on whether Julian's lawyers have, I guess there are various elements to this, but my understanding is that the cross-appeal process is likely to only be activated at the point at which Priti Patel says extradite. And Julian's lawyers have already put in their intention to cross-appeal, which has been lodged with the courts, and the courts have acknowledged that. But at this stage of the process, what is going to the Supreme Court to be looked at is the High Court decision and whether that should stand. Because if the Supreme Court says, no, the High Court decision was wrong, then the lower court verdict presumably stands. It's all very interesting because much of this is, as in much of Julian's case, most of these things have not been seen before. We haven't seen a journalist prosecuted under the Espionage Act. We haven't seen a journalist seeking asylum because somebody's trying to kill them. And then when we haven't seen that journalist being tortured through the British justice system in such a plain and open way. And we haven't seen the mainstream media colluding in that torture by smearing and destroying him while he was being tortured.
Now, I'm assuming that you and other campaigners will be outside the court tomorrow. Tell us the details for anyone who can get down there.
Certainly. The Committee to Defend Julian Assange and Don't Extradite Assange, I guess, will both, the committee is the grassroots group and Don't Extradite Assange is the formal campaign, will both be outside the court from 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. So if anybody wants to be at the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand, that's the place to be.
At 9 a.m.?
At 9 a.m., from 9 a.m. onwards. The pronouncement will be at 10:45 at the court. There will be a number of us who will be inside the court, myself as a legal observer, and I hope many journalists. But there will also be a vast number of supporters, I hope, because it's very difficult in this process to get supporters outside the courts. Firstly, because the COVID regulation was being misused, and thereafter, because we get to know at the very last moment that the hearing is taking place on the Monday. For example, we only found out on Friday that we would get the pronouncement on Monday. So to organize people at this time when everybody's quite isolated is quite difficult. So any support that those who are in London or indeed outside can give by being outside the court is much appreciated. We need to make the government see, as we have done in Kill the Bill, that the people care.
Dr. Driver, thank you very much indeed. I hope that we can celebrate at least partial good news tomorrow. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Jim in Fort Collins in the United States is on the line on the Assange subject. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, George.
Hi.
I was wondering if Julian's defense has presented to the courts that the word of the United States that he could serve his sentence in Australia or in a low, not such a high maximum security prison really isn't worth the paper it's written on, that Spain extradited somebody to the U.S. Once, and they actually had it in a contract form that this person would not be subject to high security jail and be allowed to serve a sentence in Spain. And they just reneged on it.
Yeah, sure.
So,
I sure they
understand
did.
that.
They absolutely did. And of course, the alternative of serving his sentence in Australia would require the Australian government to ask for that, even if the United States was going to or was minded to accede to it. But of course, it would be very simple for the United States government to prevail on the Australian government not to ask for it.
Yeah. I don't think the Australian government likes Julian Assange that much anyway.
They don't, and they like the United States government very much more. Jim, thanks for the call. Mark is in North Carolina on Russia. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, George. You know, one of the problems I think with the situation now in Russia, as far as the U.S., Britain, and other Western powers go, is I think many, if not most, of the leaders in these countries are on psych meds. And of course, in this country now, we've got a guy not only on psych meds, probably, but he's also demented, as well as being an imposter. And the other thing is, and this is why they're going to go up against a nation that's probably got the best army in the world today and is super nuclear equipped, capable of annihilating, destroying it. It's destroying most. Actually, between the two of us, probably destroying the world,
Yeah, sure,
And
for
that's
sure.
what-
There's no doubt. There's no doubt about that. And then, of course, there's the alliance with China. The Chinese leadership are very clear. They say that the United States undoubtedly could destroy China many times over, but we are content that we could destroy the United States only once. That's the kind of discussion we ought to be having now, Mark. This is what has moved ineluctably onto the table. This kind of talk that you and I are old enough to remember from the last terrifying days when Reagan was citing the cruise missiles, Pershing missiles all over Europe. The crisis, we thought we might be headed into World War III then. Now we're back there.
Yeah, well, one of the problems, George, is we're I don't know if you believe in God or not. I do.
I do very much.
Not in an organized religion way. I believe he is judging us, and he's watching over us. And when you take a country like ours today in the United States, that's what you just persecuting a man of peace and a man of integrity like Julian Assange, actually torturing him because of between the United States and Britain, and then you take, for instance, something like abortion, where you take a baby fully formed, fully ready to come out of the mother's womb, and stick a needle into that baby's skull and suck out the baby's brains, and this is legal. You wonder what's wrong, why we seem to be falling out. Meanwhile, Russia today is totally different as far as their religious beliefs from when they were the Soviet Union. They are a very religious nation. Vladimir Putin is, I understand, a very strict Eastern Orthodox Christian. He just celebrated. I'm not sure what the holiday is. I think it has something to do
They've
with.
just celebrated New Year. Their Christmas and New Year are into January, of course.
He went into some kind of a celebration where he went into ice cold water, walked in ice cold. The guy's tough as nails on top of everything else.
Mm-hmm. If Joe Biden ended up in the water, it would be because he'd wandered off the end of the pier. Mark, thanks for the call. Right. I must make a dent in this social media. Tipping Point UK says, as a child and young adult, I always believed in the Western propaganda, that we were the free, the ones who could choose our politicians, our way of life, read what we like. I don't know if it's a recent thing, but freedom only seems to be the freedom to follow the set agenda. Frank in Largs asks the $64,000 question. George, if they served sausage rolls at the parties, Scotch egg, does that make it a dinner party? That's a reference to the COVID regulations as well. Thanks, Frank. Leslie says NATO has been saying this for the last 8 years. It won't happen. NATO know full well they would be on their ass within the hour. Scouser Lar, my old friend in Liverpool, says it's entirely possible. We here in the West have many politicians who are always prepared to fight wars to the last drop of somebody else's blood. And Royal Blue Line says, I was deployed many a time during the freezing war, as it was always done in the winter, to keep the troops of NATO busy. At summer, you did nice things. Nothing changed. It's just the same old cycle. Deploy the RAF, crash the troops, and the money men sell war weapons. And Tony Getliff says, if Keith Vaz makes a return in place of Claudia Webb, how many terabytes will the Whip's little black book be? You need to be in Britain to understand that, and I don't have time to explain it. Che Blue says, actually, we ought to instead create a poll asking, who is the aggressor, Russia or the US and NATO? And Juan Va says World War I and World War II weren't enough. White supremacists have been responsible for all wars in the 20th and 21st centuries, plunging the rest of the exploited world into chaos, deaths, and great suffering. Yeah, there was a whole lot of white people killed in World War I and World War II. Not so much privilege there. Play Away says, I think the world knows Russia is quite capable, but they don't need to prove it. Or are they worried about some hooligans along the border, or just being completely surrounded by the West? Better take some calls, not much time left. Rusty is in Northampton. Go ahead, Rusty.
How are you doing, George?
All good, sir, thanks.
Maximum respect to you and Gatri and the team.
Thank you, sir.
I've been on to talking to you before, and well, months and months ago, and I mean, I'm getting a bit incensed by this situation with this Ukraine, because I think people are kind of losing touch with reality, or either they're asleep, right? Boris, right, he kind of models himself, or he likes to think that he's some kind of a Churchill-type character. And we've got to remember that it was Churchill that puts the Aztecs in a position which they could never retreat from. And a lot of people forget about that in history. And I'm just thinking, you know, that if there was a false flag attempt, you know, attack or something like that, say on Chernobyl, you know, I think things would be much different, and people would actually start shutting up and paying attention, because I think the whole food chain would get contaminated. And then, of course, you've got like all of Western Europe is probably going to get really messed up. I mean, I don't really think it's a good idea to be poking around like they are doing right now, NATO, because, as I say, they are on the border there, NATO. They're trying to expand the situation, and they're only expanding the problem.
In defiance of the promises that they made on the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. They promised that they would not extend NATO 1 meter outside of Germany. They would not expand towards the Russian borders. More fool Gorbachev for not getting that in writing, of course, although Jim Baker, the Secretary of State, did actually put it in writing in his own documents. Now, we've been having a fantastic week this week in podcast land. I'm entering into a whole new world now with, I'm revamping my Patreon page. I'm going to be doing a lot of very new and exciting things. I discovered, for example, a treasure trove of the hundreds of meetings that I addressed in the run-up to the Iraq War almost 20 years ago. I'll tell you, my fashion sense 20 years ago was not as good as it is now. And ditto the audience members. If you were at those meetings, which were all over the country, and thousands of you were, you'll be glad to be able to see those meetings all over again. But lots of other things, desert island discs, all kinds of things are coming up soon on my Patreon page. Details to come. But the podcast is also a part of that revamp, and we've been having an amazing week in podcast land. As you know, a mainstay in the UK top 50, but as well as many countries around the world, like Argentina and the UAE. Who'd have thunk it? A boy from a council house in Dundee is in the top charts in Argentina and the UAE. But tonight we're in the top 30 in Russia and France also. And we're the 12th podcast listened to this week in Hong Kong, China. We also have new listeners and subscribers in the Ukraine, which takes us up to 118 countries worldwide. And remember, every one of you, please leave us 5-star reviews and ratings on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. So be a friend and tell a friend about the mother of all talk shows, podcast. Share. Annie is in Paris on the Assange case. Annie, welcome back.
Hello, George.
Hello.
Just a question. Don't you think that it will be the case will be allowed to go to the appeal will be allowed to go to the
I do,
Supreme
yeah.
Court?
I'd be amazed if we don't win that tomorrow.
But don't you think that that they're just going through the motions and that actually it's a foregone conclusion that the Supreme
maybe.
Court is going to
Maybe.
rule in just the same way?
I would summarize it this way, Annie. Of all the institutions in my country, the one that is least corrupted is the upper reaches of the judiciary. That's the best I can say.
Well, yes, but it's a political decision, though, isn't it?
No, these judges in the Supreme Court are there for life. No one can remove them. And they must have some professional, juridical care for their reputation in history, for the importance of the law and the rule of law. I'm not saying that, you know, we can depend on them, not at all. But of all the institutions that we have, the upper reaches of the judiciary are the least corrupted. That's the best that I can say.
I think it was a lawyer who said to you that he felt that Assange was too important to free, which was a very chilling thing to hear. But I mean, I think he's probably right. I feel that if he's ever freed one day, it will only be when he's considered no longer a threat, and that when he's a mental and physical wreck.
Dear
That's
God.
very pessimistic.
Very,
thing to
very,
say,
very
I know,
pessimistic, yeah. Let's go to Lamsky in Bournemouth. Go ahead, sir.
How are you?
I'm good. I'm running out of voice, but go on.
Well, I just wanted to say about Russia.
Yeah.
I've legitimate reason to be wary of NATO encroaching on Russian borders through former Soviet republics.
Yeah.
Because NATO have basically been, you know, involved in regime change and war in the Middle East, you know, via America and the UK.
Even in Latin America, did you know that the North Atlantic country of Colombia is now a member of NATO?
I didn't know that,
Yeah.
but it doesn't surprise me.
Mm.
But, you know, NATO are very aggressive and Russia they have legitimate reasons to be wary. And if they want to move troops around in their own country, then, you know, that's up to them. But, you know, I think Putin is kind of testing NATO's, you know, resilience politically in some kind of hijacked manoeuvres. But he's, you know, it's quite legitimate for him to do that because it's within his own country, and also with NATO and the UK supporting what would be fascist sympathisers within the Ukraine, it doesn't surprise me that NATO, UK, and America, the US, are like that because, you know, they're very right wing. They're very, you know, the junta in America.
Well, no, I mean, the British people played a heroic role in defeating fascism and Nazism. If they knew that some of the weapons that we're sending are going to actually be on the shoulders and in the hands of actual Nazis, I think the majority of people in Britain would be absolutely horrified by it. Lamsky, I'm sorry, I have to cut you short because there's a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
Hi.
Just, well, quick points. I thought these speakers were excellent, like the Congo man. Is it Vijay Prashad?
Vijay Prashad. He's a simply wonderful teller of history.
And that Dean O'Brien on the Ukraine.
Yes. He spent a lot of years there, yeah.
Great speakers and education. And, I mean, it's so depressing with the other lady, Deepa Driver. I get so depressed on that, on the Assange, really. But the quick thing I wanted to just ask you was, how do you interpret woke?
Woke?
I know how I interpret it, but I just want to know how you do.
Yeah. Well, it's come to be known as an extreme sensibility to issues of identity politics, a fetishization of issues of sexuality, of race, of sexual orientation, of gender, and general political correctness, putting your pronoun on how you want to be known as he, him, she, her, on your bios and so on. We'll have to discuss it another time, really, Norma. It's a good question and an important one, but we've reached the end of the show. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. If so, come back next week.